Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, in which we fools attempt to bring ideas from philosophy to people who are interested in applying them in their lives. I'm Boaz. I've been a founder and executive in various companies. Now I consult with organizations on transformation.
And I'm Bryan. Welcome, everybody, to this special episode of Fools and Sages. You've heard me before, some of you. I'm a teacher and an artist and a philosopher from the backyard.
So, as Bryan just intimated, we are really excited today to have our first guest ever on the Fools and Sages podcast. Rich Rubino is a political historian specializing in American history who dubs himself nonpartisan and non-ideological. He's the author of 5 books, he's a lecturer, and he's appeared on hundreds of times on various news shows. And we'll be talking about the historical significance of the 2024 presidential election, the themes and trends of politics, ideology, and philosophy in our times, and whatever else comes up. So, Bryan, you initially connected with Rich, and you're really excited about this conversation. You want to tee it up for us?
Absolutely. I first started having small conversations with Rich over our shared affection for philological whimsy. And then I've been watching Rich literally for years now, commenting on and contextualizing the things that have been going on in current events. And as you mentioned, Rich is nonpartisan and he's non-ideological. And I think that if those two things weren't true, we wouldn't be sitting here with Rich, because he would not have caught my attention, because I've got a quick sorting mechanism. And that's what brought my attention to Rich in the first place, was that history is not partisan. History is not ideological. History is what it is. And I feel like Rich does a great justice to history. If history becomes partisan or becomes ideological, it no longer serves us. And Rich has a grasp of that. One of the things that we try to do, there's this saying that all meaning is context-based. And one of the things that we try to do here at Fools and Sages is we try to provide a context, a psychological context or a philosophical context or a religious context, to try to broaden people, to get a bigger understanding. The word context comes from Latin. Con means together, and texere means to weave. We've spoken before on the podcast how our intellectual tendency is to make things out of everything and to sort of separate them. But what context does is it shows us how things are woven together, how nothing really explains itself in a solitary condition. It's all woven together. And that's so relevant to politics, because politics is how we weave together, right? So I'm so excited to talk to Rich. I'm literally dancing. You can't see it, but I wore pants today. Now, don't go there. I know what you're thinking. I could have been wearing a kilt, right? But one of the reasons I'm excited is not just because Rich is here, but because he's agreed to do a deep dive, long format thing, which I think people now understand the importance of. They understand that chopping things into convenient pieces might help push a narrative, but it doesn't provide that context. It doesn't help broaden our understanding. And so that's why I thought that Rich just provided this incredible opportunity for us, and we are so thankful. And I'm so excited. I already want to get him back for the next for the next episode, uh, because this story is definitely not going to stop anytime in the near future. But so, Rich, I found myself, I tried to do my due diligence, so I wanted to get a little background, and I found that it seemed like you watched C-SPAN a lot when you were a kid.
Yes, as did every other kid, I'm sure, but no.
Now, is that because there weren't that many documentaries on sausage making available at the time?
I don't know where the interest came. I remember when cable came to my municipality, and all of a sudden I just got this gravitational pull. I started watching C-SPAN. I remember watching the debates, specifically the special orders. So special orders is essentially when a congressman speaks, usually late at night, and they reserve some time after the session has been gavelled to a close, and they would speak to an empty chamber for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours, and it would be kind of it would really be a monologue, not a dialogue, because it would be one member and usually, or it would be a couple members talking about how much they agree on something. That kind of got me really into it.
And they do that to get it on the record?
Yes, it was. Yes, absolutely. And you'd have to have somebody that would be a speaker designate that would sit up there and have to listen to them for hours on end. I remember Bob Dornan from California, a congressman from Orange County, very angry, and I used to just listen to him and kind of be like, "Wow, listen to what he's saying." And that kind of got me interested. I remember Congressman Gene Taylor from Mississippi. I used to watch him come up, and he used to give speeches about how to balance the budget, and I found the way that he spoke kind of amazeballs in a certain degree. So that's what got me into it. I mean, other things too. I mean, liking presidential books, and I just for some reason just gravitated toward that. I don't know where it was kind of the impetus was, but it was there.
Uh-huh. Well, it seems like there's almost a drive. Something about C-SPAN is like it's reality TV,
Yeah, it is
right?
absolutely.
You couldn't make up half of this stuff. Is that fair
Especially
to say?
now, absolutely, it gets better and better.
Especially now. And so there's an interesting movement, I think, maybe through technology for the public at large to want to get more into reality and less into scripted stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that you see more of a lot of a movement away from the mainstream media. I think it's amazing when you think about the fact that there still is actually a 6:30 news, that it still actually exists. Because certainly when you go back to the days of Huntley and Brinkley and Walter Cronkite, people would go there and they would say, "This is where I'm going to get my news." But there are just so many, there's such a litany of different sources that people can get. And for one thing, first of all, and this is probably perilous, but a lot of people try to gravitate toward sources that they agree with, and they only follow sources that they agree with, and it becomes almost an echo chamber, and they get to the point where they demonize people that don't agree with them, because at least when they're talking to people, everybody agrees and they believe that it's kind of this Manichaean struggle, and they're on the side of good and the other side is the source of evil. But I think that some people do gravitate toward other sources. I think there's certainly alternative media, and there's a litany of alternative medias: conservative, liberal, libertarian, whatever ideology you want. You can have a source. But if you go to C-SPAN and you watch the actual, if you can watch the actual House debates, the actual Senate debates, you're seeing it unfiltered, and then that's probably the best way you can make up your own mind. Obviously, every thinking being has some sort of an inclination, whether it's ideologically or in terms of how we think, in terms of how our mind works, and we gravitate towards certain philosophies. But I think that this is probably the best way. This is probably the most uncolored way to follow politics that I can think about.
And that parallels a theme that we've talked about here on the podcast. Within Buddhism, we have this idea we've spoken about of right view.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buddhist idea of right view means that it's not contaminated by your personal hopes and dreams or any of that. You just want to see it as if you were the wall, impassively observing anything that passes in front of you. And boy, I mean, there's a psychological challenge there, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and it's extremely hard, especially if you've grown up in a certain environment. If you've grown up in somewhere like, say, Biloxi, Mississippi, where the people around you are very conservative, or contrary-wise, if you grew up in San Francisco, California, where most people around you are very liberal, you have to be a contrarian, and it's very hard if you're going to think another way. Where do you get that information? You kind of already have a certain bias because of the way that you're raised, the way that you're reared, people around you saying certain things growing up in school, you basically, and then the people that you're around, it really does have an effect on you. Some people will just be, some people are just naturally contrarian, I think. I think people that join the Libertarian Party or the Green Party, for example, are just have that natural proclivity to kind of be away from the mainstream. And then you have people that are just kind of, and this is kind of the, I guess, untalked about demographic, is people that are just kind of blasé about the whole political process in the first place. And there are millions and millions of people that are completely depoliticized, that don't vote, that don't follow it. Probably on election night, they'll turn it on for a couple minutes. And that's really millions and millions of people. That's why political candidates always are frustrated. And you always hear this, by the way, when there's a candidate who's an insurgent, they always say, we're going to get all these non-voters are going to come out. They say, well, how are you going to get them? They're going to say, well, we're going to get all these voters because they're going to all of a sudden be galvanized and they're going to come to our side. I remember Howard Dean, when he ran in 2004 for the Democratic presidential nomination, he kept on saying, we're going to bring all the college students out. Well, a lot of the college students didn't actually come out to vote. So it's very interesting how you kind of galvanize people. Some candidates are able to do it from talking away from politics. Jesse Ventura, when he ran for governor of Minnesota in 1998, for example, brought into the political process a lot of people that had absolutely no interest in politics. They probably weren't really informed about politics, but they knew Jesse Ventura from his wrestling days, and they probably only came out and voted for him. I think Donald Trump also had a little bit of that. There were a lot of people that only came for him because they liked him, because they thought that he was the only person that was kind of unalligated to the Washington establishment. And that's the people that he's really brought into the process. And I think that other folks like Howard Dean kind of failed. I think, go back to 1992, Jerry Brown, when he ran for president, his slogan was question authority. And he also brought in a lot of college students, and he was able to do it on the left, bring in a lot of people that normally are kind of disengaged, if you will.
Right. So you mentioned the impact of school.
Yep.
What was that like for Rich Rubino?
I was very quiet growing up, very quiet actually, and I didn't really say much. I certainly was not a standout student whatsoever. I went to Marblehead High School in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and then I went to Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I studied political science and media communications, and I really kind of fell in love with both subjects, and I wanted to sort of amalgamate the two. When you're studying political science, it's not necessarily for people that don't study and think that it's all about studying contemporaneous politics, studying polls. A lot of it is really studying about the state of nature. It's about studying where politics came, where the idea of politics came from. We can talk about it later. The idea that there was a state of nature and that people wanted to leave the state of nature. So a lot of it is really kind of philosophical. You do a lot of Aristotle, a lot of Socrates, and that's really a lot of the political process is political philosophy, especially when you study kind of a small, I know you went to a small Catholic school too. That's really what politics is. It's not necessarily simply to learn it as a vocation, but more or less to learn it as to learn the origins of it. And then I went to Emerson College and studied journalism. And from there, I got a master's degree there. And then from there, I started working and then read around. I started looking for a book, and this is a couple years later, that was something that was not just presidential trivia. I'd already read a lot of presidential trivia books. I wanted something that's more political trivia. And I learned in terms of journalism that I'm a lot better, by the way, when I'm unplugged. And journalism, specifically broadcast journalism, tends to be something where you very much have to kind of memorize something, and you're very scripted. Everything has to be within a minute and a half package. Believe it or not, packages on TV, each story is usually only a minute and a half, so you really don't have any time for creativity. And I didn't particularly like that about the business, but I landed up writing a couple books. And the first book was about the political Bible of little known facts in American politics. Then the political Bible of humorous quotations in American politics. Then a book called Make Every Vote Equal, When a Novel Idea. And then I wrote a book called American Politics on the Rocks. And then my latest book is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids. So I get to use the creativity, and I get to kind of explain a lot about politics and going back to the origins of it, as opposed to just from a purely kind of vocational type of a standpoint.
And we're going to have those books listed on our show notes on the Fools and Sages podcast.com website.
Very smart decision.
For folks, I think so. Us fools have to stick with the people who know stuff. Well, so how did the ball come off the bat then from that experience? Just as as far as getting a perspective or a viewpoint. I know that we spoke before about the roots of our mutual nonpartisanship and the foundation for an understanding that puts you in a non-ideological place.
It's hard because you go against human instincts. Human instincts is to gravitate toward a certain point of view. Just when you're having a regular conversation with somebody, you tend to take a certain point of view. I tend to look at it almost as an extraterrestrial, if I can. Somebody
Right.
looking down on planet Earth and wondering kind of where they got their ideology. And one thing I do notice, and when you're trying to look at it nonpartisan, is that in almost every argument there is an incongruity. There's some way that people are hypocrites. Everyone tries to go after hypocrites, say, you're a hypocrite. This is hypocrisy. You're not doing it straight. This is hypocrisy. I try to leave that away because most people, when it comes down to it, they don't realize it. It's unconscious, but we all almost are all hypocrites in some degree because very few political or ideological, theological views are 100% consistent. You can look at every view and you can say, well, what about this? What about that? And I'm always trying to look at that. And sometimes I don't even necessarily mention it. But I say, if you're saying something here, then I don't even agree with or disagree with it, but I'm saying there's a certain inconsistency to what you're saying over there. And I just think we have to get to a point where we just have to realize that basically, we're all kind of trying to navigate this planet together. And ideology is very rarely commensurate with consistency.
And there's no piece of paper so thin that
No,
it doesn't have two sides.
no, and there are nuances, and things can be nebulous. And as you say, there's usually sometimes oftentimes when people talk, and this includes political candidates, very rarely do they outright lie. Usually what they do is they say a technical truth. There's got to be some way that you can go back to the person. If you say something and it's completely mendacious, someone's going to go back to you and say, where did you get that from? You have to be able to say something that has some semblance of truth. What they do is they lie by omission. They leave certain things out. It's very easy to leave certain things out. For example, you could say, let's say there's a tax cut that affects 60 million people. You could say that tax cut is going to affect bank robbers. Now, chances are, if it's affecting 60 million people, probably maybe 10 bank robbers are affected by it. So it's true. Obviously, you're leaving stuff out, and that's what politicians usually do. And I kind of look at that, and it's very hard sometimes to find something that you can say, this is 100% true or this is 100% false. And it's usually there's his side, her side, and there's usually some truth to both sides. And this is true not only politics, but this is true in any sort of a conversation or dialogue. And then the truth is usually somewhere in the middle.
Right. Bo?
So non-ideological to you, Rich, also means that kind of accepting the inconsistency in the
Oh yeah.
position of being non-ideological,
Yes,
right?
and yes, absolutely. Everything I never excoriate somebody's argument, and I've learned this as being hypocritical because most people don't realize they are hypocritical. And most arguments, you can make the case that this person, there is some semblance of hypocrisy. Like, for example, and this isn't necessarily my view, but let's say somebody is very much against um, illegal immigration and they keep saying, well, they're here illegally, they're here illegally. Then you ask them a question like, well, have you ever broken the law yourself? And oftentimes the person you might say, have you ever did you smoke marijuana before it was legal in your state? And they might say, well, yes, I did. Well, people don't realize it consciously, but that's an inconsistency. If you're somebody who's very much an advocate of law enforcement, then theoretically you should live that same lifestyle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to spend our entire lives trying to find every incongruity in every argument we make. And I think sometimes people try to do that. They immediately say, you're a hypocrite. You're a hypocrite. Well, I think that, there's a lot of nuances to that. And obviously coming over the country illegally is different than, say, smoking pot or drinking before you were 21 years old, something to that effect. But it is an incongruity.
Right. Well, and we talk about at different times here on the podcast that there's a philosophical issue that happens whenever we have a mental model or a mental picture, even if it's pure and perfect, like mathematics. we still have to go through a process to apply it. So,
Yes.
like in law, we have the law, but then we have case law, where judges and courts have argued how does this sort of theoretical, disembodied law apply to this guy sitting here in front of us and this particular event that happened. And
Yep.
and yeah, the human mechanism always, I don't think that politicians are necessarily trying to lie, with certain exceptions. Uh, I think that what they're often trying to do is to give us a worldview. And we have our personal worldviews, and then we have some collective worldviews, and there's a thing to try to harmonize individuals with our collective views, and that's why emotional issues tend to rise to the top, things that get people on a visceral level, rather than cold arguments about bookkeeping or budgetary issues. Something, you know what they say, if it bleeds, it leads,
Yep.
is the newspaper thing, right?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, if you will. Very, I think for the most part, politicians, people immediately say, well, politicians are all liars. Politicians, in and of themselves, you got to remember, are us. They come from the people. They're people like us that run for office. Maybe there's some sort of, maybe they start with some sort of, they want a traffic light on their street, and then eventually they become an advocate for that. They run for state rep. They run for something else. They're no different than everybody else. And people immediately say, well, politicians, they treat politicians almost like they're an other. They're really
Right.
just individuals, and just like everybody else, they lie sometimes, they tell the truth sometimes. They try to do everything they can for job security. The number one rule of human civilization is, I think, is preservation. And you want to preserve yourself. You have some sort of a strategy, just like in any other field that you go into. If you take a job working at New Balance sneakers and you start at the bottom, you want to do everything you can to become president of New Balance sneakers. So accordingly, you try to maneuver yourself to move your way up. Now, if you're a politician, let's say if you're a politician, you want to be governor. So you say, okay, I'm going to start as a state representative, and then let's say I'm from a very liberal area and I want to run for a state representative. So I have liberal values when I'm there, and I have a liberal voting record. Then let's say you're in a state like, let's say you were elected as a state rep in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is a very liberal citadel in the state of Utah. Then all of a sudden you start moving up. You want to run statewide for governor of Utah, and you say, well, if I continue to be a liberal, to have a liberal voting record, I'm not going to get elected governor. So what do? You start to move to the center, just like everybody else. You try to manipulate the situation for yourself. I mean, self-interest is also, I think, probably the second rule, if you will, of human civilization. And people immediately say, well, that's inconsistent. That's inconsistent. You're different. You were different when you were a state representative than you are now. But I think it's very rare for a politician to have the same kind of ideology their entire life. Now, that being said, I can think of two exceptions to that. One of them on the libertarian side. Libertarianism, whatever you think of it, is a very consistent view. It basically says that government is a limited purpose entity, and it tends to be very consistent about that. They have disagreements. Abortion rights, for example, there are libertarians that support abortion rights, and because they believe, they say that the Constitution guarantees life, liberty, and property. They say the word life there means that it's constitutional to protect life. Then there are others that say it's bodily autonomy. The government shouldn't be in your bedroom. So that's one of the few issues that they can be inconsistent on. But generally speaking, somebody like Ron Paul, who was a congressman from Texas, ran for the Libertarian nomination once for president and won it, and then ran for the Republican presidential nomination a couple times, has basically been saying the same thing since he first ran for Congress. On the other side of that, Bernie Sanders, who's somebody who's a Democratic socialist, when he was first running for office, his basic message, and it was very consistent, his basic message is essentially that government needs to protect the little people, that it needs to that there needs to be a greater role for the public good versus kind of individual rights. That's been his ideology since the beginning, and he hasn't really changed much on that. Whereas you see, though, the candidates that really get to the highest level of politics, generally speaking, are people that have changed their ideology. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, is somebody who used to be very liberal, for example, or at least moderate on immigration. He used to favor what I would say is essentially almost Medicare for all at one point. he had to change his position because he was running in a Republican primary. That's what happens when you get to that level. Another example, Barack Obama, when he was in the state Senate from a relatively liberal district in Chicago, he was somebody who favored gay marriage. Then he ran for United States Senate, and he changed his views on that issue and became an opponent of that. He continued to be an opponent of that when he ran for the Democratic nomination and then for president in 2008. Then, gradually, as the polls tended to swing the other way, he became an advocate for gay marriage. And I think that those are the politicians that are most successful are those that are somewhat malleable. It's like they used to say, I guess you could say that the only real consistent, real absolute in some respects is that there are no absolutes in terms of politicians.
Right. Now, to be the devil's advocate,
Yes.
you might argue that we kind of want that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I don't know how much we want that. I think politicians look at polls, and when they look at polls, by the way, sometimes the poll is not necessarily what position should I take, but what should I emphasize? They might say, these are my
Right.
views on 7 issues. I'm running for governor. Which issue do you think is most important? And then that's not necessarily a bad thing. Then that candidate will then say, okay, this is what I'm going to emphasize. I may also have these other views, and if I'm asked my position on those other views, I'm going to acerbate this, I'm going to acerbate that. But I have but this is something that I need to emphasize, which is why I think, for example, Kamala Harris keeps on saying that she grew up in a middle class family, or John Edwards kept saying that my father worked in a mill all his life. They obviously had some sort of polls that showed that if you kept saying that people wanted somebody who did not come from a silver spoon in his mouth. So we kept on repeating it to the point that it almost became doctrinaire.
Right.
I've always
Right.
wondered, Rich, why is it that politicians' views get so much emphasis when the way I understand it, their role is to represent their constituents and the
Yeah.
views of their constituents. Like, and I can understand we want to elect people that see the world the way that we do, but wouldn't a good representative be a little more of a blank slate and represent what the constituents actually, like, what a majority of the constituency actually wants?
That is the $64,000 question about representative government. When you're electing somebody, are you electing them to essentially just be your tribune, be almost somebody who would take a poll and say, okay, 55% think I should vote yay, therefore I'm going to go out and vote yay? Or are they supposed to be leaders? Are they supposed to be people that are supposed to see the world or see what can benefit the district, even if it's an unpopular position with them amongst their own constituents? And there are kind of two arguments in that. One of them would say, well, we elect you, you were your bosses, and if that's the case, then theoretically everything would be just a poll. You just take a poll,
Right.
and then the person's ideology would be completely irrelevant. And to a certain degree, politicians know that if they do take unpopular stances with their constituents, that there's a very strong chance that they could that they could lose reelection. That being said, that being said, you also have the scenario sometimes where you have somebody getting elected and with an ideology that is sometimes out of sync with their constituents. I think of Dale Bumpers in Arkansas, for example. He was governor from 1971 to 75, and then he became senator from 1975 to 1999. And he was a lot more liberal than the state of Arkansas. He had a very liberal voting record. He made no bones about it. He would actually call himself a liberal, and he would get overwhelmingly reelected because people liked him, even though the people generally disagreed with him. I think another example would probably be which we're watching right now, the Montana Senate race. John Tester is certainly left of center, who's running for reelection, but the people in Montana are very much right of center. They probably like John Tester more than his opponent, perhaps, and they think he's a real Montanan, but he doesn't necessarily vote the way as conservative as I think Montana is today. So it's a great question, and I guess it's for each constituent to decide for him or herself. Do they want somebody who's going to kind of be a charismatic leader, somebody who's going to vote their conscience, or do they want somebody that is just going to be kind of a yay vote or a nay vote? I guess if that's the case, then theoretically you could just have AI vote yay, vote nay, and not have the personality factor of
Well,
it.
I think it takes a heck of a lot of integrity to actually represent the constituency. I don't think that's I mean, you could say AI has integrity because it doesn't have any other incentives or whatever, so that works. But I wouldn't say it's just a, you know, just a yes man or woman, right? It's like you know, to because who knows to what extent special interests or whatever are
Mhm.
influencing um, the leadership, the so-called leadership you refer to, right?
It's interesting. I think what this comes down to is, should the United States, or any, for this matter, any federal government, is constitutional republic the best possible form of government? In a direct democracy, that's what would happen. The people in the town that are eligible, say everyone 18 or over, would go to that want to go, would go to a church or a high school, and just like they do in New England, they would have a town meeting, right? And the town meeting, they would say, okay, people would go up, one person would propose yay, someone would propose nay, then they'd all be in their clickers and they'd say, okay, what's the vote going to be? And then whatever the vote is, that becomes the policy. Now, that
Right.
theoretically, if you go back in American history, as much as we talk about the Revolutionary War and how it changed America from being from being servile to Britain, there was also a revolution against direct democracy. If you go back to the Mayflower Compact, for example, 40 people basically signed an agreement, and that was very much a direct democracy. You go through the Virginia
Right.
Rights of Man, you go through the influence of Montesquieu, John Locke, other philosophers, and eventually you come up with this system of checks and balances. But you come up with a system whereas we're not a direct democracy, but instead you have people making decisions for you. And I guess theoretically, and you can make this case at the time, it could be that the people are not necessarily informed. Most people, if you ask them about the intricacies of the farm bill, couldn't tell you anything. So I guess you're electing the congressperson, and that congressperson's job is to try to interpret it and try to do what's kind of best for their constituents, because most people have lives. Most people are not 100% into are not 100% into politics. And if you are a direct democracy, everybody has to really have an interest. Otherwise, people are just going to be coming and they're going to be making an uninformed vote.
Right. Well, that's really a topic that I wanted to get into to present the real historical and philosophical setting that this whole situation came out of. And but I don't want to wait too long before we talk about the election
Oh
that's
yeah, there's
that
one going on,
upon
isn't
us.
there?
So maybe give us your read on that, and then after that, I want to go all the way back. I mean, I think there's some things to talk about with Socrates, but then also the French and the British, and then we get to the American chapter, which I think is actually so unique. Again, we said everything's context based, and I don't get that we really understand what it means to be part of the American experiment unless we get that bigger, longer story. And particularly the dialogue between the two parties that has happened through history, or the two sides of issues that these parties come to represent. But
Yeah.
so right now, we're in this place where the right and the left are very clearly separated to some degree. And there's a lot of uniquenesses in the position that we are. What do you speak to that a little bit?
It's very interesting what's happened ideologically to the country in terms of how Donald Trump has really transmogrified the ideological separation of the United States. From 1940, from when Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Republican nominee in 1952 through 2000, excuse me, through 2012, when Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee, the Republican Party was always known as the party of free trade. They wanted open markets. Every candidate basically said that. They were also known as a party that wanted more liberal immigration laws, and a party that wanted generally more intervention overseas. They were seen as internationalist, if you will. Barry Goldwater in 1964 was probably the one little kind of caveat to that.
Right.
Donald Trump comes in and he says, "I'm an economic nationalist." He says, "I want tariffs." He said the tariffs is the
Right.
best word in the English dictionary. That was those were Democrats that supported that. Go back to the NAFTA debate in 1993, back in 1993 when Bill Clinton signed NAFTA. He had to rely on Republican votes to get it through. The majority leader in the House of Representatives, Dick Gephardt, and the majority whip, David Bonnier, were both basically working against their own against NAFTA. He had to work with Bob Michael, the minority leader, Newt Gingrich, the minority whip, Bob Dole, the Senate majority leader, to get it through. The Republican Party were known as the party of free trade. Donald Trump comes in and he says that NAFTA was probably the worst deal that's ever been negotiated by the United States. And he's doing this as a Republican on intervention. Go back to the days of George W. Bush, for example. The party was very much known as the interventionist party, and the entire Republican United States Senate, when it came to voting for the use of authorization of use of force in the country of Iraq, only Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island and the Republican Party voted against it, and he later became an independent, then a Democrat.
Now, explain what an interventionist is for folks.
Very good, very good. You hear a term all the time, isolationism. And isolationism, I would argue, is really non-existent. Isolationism would imply, I don't see it in any country, that you have no relations with any other country. You don't trade.
That island off of India, maybe.
What's that?
That island off of India that kills anybody who lands up on the shore.
Yes, that's a very good point. I didn't even think of that. But for a big country, take India as a country, for example, you have relations with other countries. You have trade relations. You have ambassadors. You allow people to travel to other countries. A truly isolationist country would be a country that has no relations with any other country, doesn't trade with any other country, doesn't exchange ambassadors or recognize anybody. North Korea is probably the closest, but I mean, even North Korea has relations with Russia, for example. They're sending troops to Russia to fight the Ukraine, so even they are not an isolationist country.
Yeah. And China,
What I would argue is there's a non-interventionist is an ideology that believes that your country should not intervene in the affairs of other countries, unless obviously you're attacked or you think that your country is about to be attacked. Other than that, you basically stay out. You don't have troops, for example, on bases in other countries. As I say, that doesn't mean that you're completely isolationist. You still exchange ambassadors. You still negotiate trade deals, that type of thing. That's what a non-interventionist is.
Right.
And this non-interventionism is something that's really on the right and the left. Pat Buchanan, for example, was very much an interventionist during the Cold War. When the Cold War was over, 1991, there was really a schism in the Republican Party. There were those like Pat Buchanan that says, okay, we've won the Cold War. Now it's time to worry about ourselves. Now we have to bring now we essentially have to bring the troops home, and we have to get out of international organizations like the UN, like NATO. Then there were those like William Crystal, for example, who was chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle, and he formed the newspaper. His father was actually began it, and they were the neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives argued that that the United States, which should be the hegemonic power, we should basically rule the world, and we need to intervene overseas to protect United States interest.
The neocons, for short.
You can even what's that? Cons
the
for
neocons, for short.
Neocons, yes, absolutely. You can go further to so you might say, where did this movement begin? They were actually former Democrats. And if you go back to the they were very much, the Democratic Party was very much interventionist under Truman, when Stevenson was a nominee, Kennedy, Johnson, Humphrey. In 1972, a senator from Washington State named Henry Scoop Jackson was their candidate. They all supported Henry Scoop Jackson. Jackson was somebody who was very munificent on social services, very liberal on domestic policy, and very much on foreign policy. He was somebody who was very much of a hawk. Basically, the belief is that part of a neoconservative view is that the United States has almost a manifest destiny to try to spread their values, constitutional republic, throughout the world. And if other countries become democratic, then eventually this country becomes democratic. Then it kind of comes like a wildfire, and other countries become democratic. And eventually, the entire world is democratic, and then democracies don't fight wars. It goes back to Immanuel Kant, actually. Immanuel Kant used to talk about almost this idea of perpetual war for perpetual peace, but he really talked about this idea of the democratic peace theory, that countries don't go to war because they have economic interest, and that democracies will not go to war, small L democracies. So that's really where it comes. Scoop Jackson was like your candidate in 1972. He lost the nomination to George McGovern. When that happened, a lot of the neoconservatives gradually matriculated over to the Republican Party. 1976, Scoop Jackson runs again for the nomination, loses to Jimmy Carter, and many neoconservatives believe that Jimmy Carter was too soft on foreign policy. They gradually moved over to the Republican Party. In 1980, Ronald Reagan is running for the presidency, and he invites the neoconservatives to become Republicans. He also invites a lot of Christian right people who had supported Jimmy Carter in 76 to become Republicans. So they've been Republicans ever since.
Right.
And in 1991, folks like Pat Buchanan says that whole consensus that we've had with where we brought the neoconservatives, basically the neoconservatives served a purpose, but now we need to worry about ourselves and we need to bring the troops home. Others like William Crystal said, no, we need to continue that foreign policy. We're the unipolar polar power in the world. We need to use our power and we need to spread democracy almost like a national project.
Right.
And George W. Bush was running for president in 2000. And in the primaries, most neoconservatives did not support him. William Crystal, for example, they supported John McCain's bid for the nomination because Bush talked about a more humble foreign policy. He talked about how he didn't want us to be seen as the ugly American. And he
Kinder, gentler machine gun hand.
And he emphasized domestic issues. Then 9/11 comes. And 9/11 comes, all of a sudden, there is a very much a kind of gung-ho view to go after somebody. And obviously, there was almost universal support for going into Afghanistan at the time to try to take out Osama bin Laden. But there was also talk, and this is Donald Rumsfeld, who was very much a neoconservative, the day after, who said, "This is now our time. We can go into Iraq." And you go into Iraq. If you make Iraq into a constitutional republic like the United States, then Iran will see that. Then they'll become a democratic republic. Then it's going to spread all over the Middle East. It's going to spread all over the world, and eventually there'll be world peace. We'll all be democracies. That's the neoconservative view. The non-interventionist view says that the United States should bring our troops home. We should not have troops in military. We should not have troops in foreign military bases. Now, there are two sides on trade on that. The Pat Buchanan view is that we should have tariffs on other countries in order to protect United States industries. The Ron Paul view is that there should really be almost unfettered trade between our countries, and that we should almost there should not be any tariffs. So that's where they kind of disagree on that, but they both generally agree that the United States does more harm by intervening in other countries' affairs than they do good. And this time around, Jill Stein, this is where it goes the right and the left. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, is very much a non-interventionist. And Donald Trump on the right is somebody that, unlike other Republicans, is very incredulous toward foreign interventions. And he's talked very poorly about going into Iraq, for example, and Afghanistan. I'll just leave you with this. In 2008, Ron Paul and Rudy Giuliani were in a Republican debate. And they were asking a question about September 11th, and Ron Paul made the statement that we were attacked because we're over there. What did he mean by that? He was talking about Osama bin Laden. He said basically that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda attacked the United States because of their grievance was, and this is what was in Osama bin Laden's fatwa, that the United States during the Gulf War and after the Gulf War had stationed troops in Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina, and that is something that is seen as sacrilege in the Islamic religion. And there was when the Gulf War, after Iraq went into Kuwait, Osama bin Laden offered the Saudi royal family 100,000 Arab Afghan Mujahideen troops to protect Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader, very much an adversary of Osama bin Laden. Instead, folks like Colin Powell and Dick Cheney Brent Scowcroft persuaded the Saudi royal kingdom to instead allow U.S. troops over there. So we brought U.S. troops over there, and they do not believe that there should be non-Christian, non-Muslim troops in some of these areas. And that's what galvanized them. Then you had the sanctions after the Gulf War, the sanctions on Iraq, which galvanized a lot of people in the Islamic world because they believed that they were starving people. And then they believed that our support for autocratic regimes in places like Jordan, which they believe is autocratic regimes, they wanted somebody who was not necessarily a secular nationalist. They wanted somebody who's more of a theocrat, if you will. But that was basically his argument. So he said, we're over there. they're over here because we're over there. And really, Giuliani looks at him and says, that sounds like that Saudi prince that came over here and, and blamed it all on us. He says, I hope you don't mean that. The next day, there was talk about not letting Ron Paul in any of those debates. Now that belief, folks like Vivek Ramaswamy, Donald Trump, a lot of now establishment Republicans, because they become the establishment, are very much in favor of are very closer to Ron Paul than they are to Rudy Giuliani or George W. Bush or Dick Cheney.
Right.
And Dick Cheney's even endorsed Vice President Harris.
Right. And so yeah, now we come to today. I mean, that's a great explanation and background about why people are so confused.
Yes, that's a fascinating question. That is fascinating. Ideologies, what used to be conservatism, imagine at the Republican National Convention this past summer, if George W. Bush got up and gave a speech, or if Dick Cheney got up and gave a speech, they would roundly be booed. This is not the Republican Party of George W. Bush or Mitt Romney or John McCain or Ronald Reagan. You had a head of a union going up and giving a speech talking about the power of transnational corporations and talking about why he was against free trade. You had J.D. Vance get up there, the Republican vice presidential nominee, criticizing Joe Biden, and part of his criticism of Joe Biden was that Joe Biden voted for the authorization of use of force in Iraq and that Joe Biden voted for NAFTA. Well, those used to be the staples of conservatism. You have a scenario now where Dick Cheney, who from 2003 to 2008 was demonized by the Democrats. In 2008, every Democrat running from cemetery commissioner to president of the United States tried to run against Dick Cheney and link their opponent to Dick Cheney. Now, all of a sudden, Dick Cheney is supporting Vice President Harris, and Tim Walz says in one of the debates, we have this great coalition from Bernie Sanders to Taylor Swift to Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney's daughter, very much as hawkish as her father, is now out campaigning with the Democratic presidential nominee, Bill Kristol, that neoconservative advocate. He is now a supporter of Vice President Harris. The Democrats have very much become a party of intervention in many respects overseas. For example, in the Ukraine, it's more the conservatives that oppose intervention over there or oppose continue to sending their arms over there. And on the issue of trade, it's Vice President Harris who's saying we do not need these tariffs, and Donald Trump saying we need 10% across the board tariffs. Well, that sounds more like Bernie Sanders or Jerry Brown of a year of old than it does the Republican Party. So I can see where a lot of people could be very confused, and the anti-war movement is really on the right and the left now. There's certainly folks like Jill Stein, who I think Jill Stein and folks on the right wing of the Republican Party are really in agreement that the United States needs to essentially come home and that we do more harm than good. And then folks in the center left, like Joe Biden, and the center right, like Mitch McConnell, talk about how we need to basically protect democracies overseas over autocracies. So this is a battle between good and evil. It's so different. It was very black and white. When George Bush was president, conservatives supported going into Iraq almost ecumenically, and liberals on the other side generally were against going into Iraq. So there's really no grand unifying theory of America, the American body politic contemporaneously. It's confusing.
Rich, are we seeing the same kind of crossover in domestic affairs that you're describing in foreign policy?
That's a great question. I think that, yes, I do. I think that in terms of labor unions, for example, labor unions used to be the bedrock of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was known as a party of labor unions. Now you have a scenario, in part because Donald Trump's views on issues like trade, where some labor unions are actually either supporting Donald Trump. I mean, members of the labor unions. I'm not talking about the leaders of the union, I'm talking about the rank and file voters. Or they are very kind of wishy-washy supporting the Democratic candidate. Many are culturally very conservative. Many are gun owners, and while they believe, and many, because Donald Trump is not somebody that wants unfettered, unreserved free trade, if you will, many of them believe that Donald Trump better shares their values than do the Democrats. And unions are something that's really not monolithic. If you look at, for example, police unions, Republicans very much advocate for police unions, and police unions usually support the Republican presidential candidate. 1988, for example, the Massachusetts Fraternal Order of Police supported George H.W. Bush over Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. So unions are not monolithic. The border control, the border agents, for example, are more conservative. They supported they did not support Harris. They supported Donald Trump. The other side, you have teachers unions, which tend to be more democratic. The AFSCME unions, the public employees unions tend to be more democratic, but that can be very confusing too, because when you say the word union, a lot of people immediately say, well, those are obviously Democrats. But I think that for the most part, if you talk to a cop, if you talk to a state trooper, if you talk to a border agent, it's very rare if you're going to find one that's going to say, I'm voting for Vice President Harris. And then again, if you talk to someone who's a teacher, for example, it'd be very rare to say if somebody who say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. So the unions are very much divided as well. It's really just divided, and it's not as black and white as it was at one point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are we ready to go back a little bit and see how this all started, or do you have more things about that we can put in now about the election today? I know that there's some parallels with my friend Grover.
Oh yes,
and and maybe just those easy threads, but then I want to take the deep dive back in history. But I want to feel like we've done this justice, this part.
What you said is very interesting. So just for some background, Grover Cleveland gets elected president in 1884. And interestingly, you hear all the talk about the anti-Puerto Rican joke made in Madison Square Garden this past weekend. Part of the reason Grover Cleveland won was there was a Presbyterian minister named Samuel Burchard, and he delivered a speech 2 days before the election where he was advocating the Republican candidate James G. Blaine, and he called the Democratic Party the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. What does that mean? Rum. Well, a lot of Democrats, specifically in the state of New York, critical swing state, 36 electoral votes at the time, many of these Democrats he's basically saying they're from, many of them were Irish immigrants. So he's saying rum, meaning that they're alcoholics. And he's saying Romanism, meaning that their allegiance is not to the country, but to the Catholic Church, and rebellion because they'll rebel against the country. And James G. Blaine didn't condemn it. Consequently, Grover Cleveland wins by 1,047 votes in the state of New York. And with that, the Electoral College and the presidency.
Right. And we should mention that Prohibition hadn't happened yet.
True.
But the rum and there was already the stirrings of of Prohibition. So there were already a cultural currents to kind of, again, those emotional points that our flames that are already getting fanned. The politicians use that as a point.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly people at the time were kind of looked down upon if they were Irish immigrants. And certainly they were looked upon as alcohol. Oh, that's another thing. And Chester Arthur in 1882 signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And
Right.
that was and Chester A. Arthur was actually the incumbent president at the time. And he actually sought the Republican presidential nomination. This is the last time that a president has sought their party's nomination, gone all the way to the convention, and then landed up losing. He landed up losing to James G. Blaine. Arthur only became president because James Garfield had died in 1881. So in 1884, Grover Cleveland wins, and at the time, the Democratic Party is indistinguishable from the Democratic Party contemporaneously. It was a conservative party. So Cleveland served a term, loses re-election to the inimitable Benjamin Harrison. The story is the last day in office, Frances Folsom Cleveland, Grover Cleveland. By the way, she was 21 years old and married Cleveland, who was 46 years old, in with the White House. Imagine that happening today. Part of the reason she couldn't go to his inauguration was because she had finals in college that day. That's how young she was, and they had it, in the White House, called the executive mansion at the time. So Grover Cleveland loses re-election. She says, Frances Cleveland says, keep the place nice. We'll be back in 4 years. They come back in 4 years, and there's a panic of 1893, Great Depression, 18% unemployment. People come to Washington saying, please, 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 Mr. President, we need you to stimulate the economy. Cleveland says no. He says, I'm basically a guardian president's the term he uses, and the federal government should do very little to try to stimulate the economy. Consequently,
and then we had labor strikes too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Pullman strike, absolutely.
The Pullman strike of 1894.
This was an awful time to be a worker in America. And in 1896, Cleveland is very unpopular. He does not seek re-election. And the Democratic Party that year nominates somebody with a completely different ideology, and that's William Jennings Bryan. He was a former two-term congressman from Nebraska. He ran for Senate. At the time, the parties chose, or the state legislators chose the senators. So he would have been, so if the Democrats had won control of the Nebraska legislature, they would have chosen him, but they didn't choose him. And then he goes around the
Right.
country on a speaking tour. And the Republicans won instead of the Democrats, and he talked about the need for why he was against the gold standard, why he needed more government services.
Right.
1896, he gives a speech at the convention. He talks about how man should not be crucified upon a cross of gold. And all of a sudden, the first liberal Democrat is nominated for president.
Right.
Grover
Now,
Cleveland.
let me just interject here. A lot of Americans might not know the name William Jennings Bryant,
Yep.
but they actually know of William Jennings Bryant. And you know what I'm going to say?
Ghost
If they
trial.
know about the Wizard of Oz, because William Jennings Bryant was the Cowardly Lion.
Yes, absolutely.
And in the original version, they weren't ruby slippers, they were silver slippers. And it was about the gold standard, silver standard. And the idea she could click her heels. She had the way, she had the answer the whole time. She just needed to know it. And there it was with the silver shoes. So that's one of the things I've just always loved. The scarecrow is the farm worker,
Yep.
and the Tin Man is the factory worker, and there was all this strife from the strikes and the economy, and it was all sort of translated across there. And I just love that, so I had to put that
Oh
in
no,
there.
that's fascinating, and you're
Yeah.
right. I would not have thought of that, but a lot of that movie does come originally from what was going on in 1896, and it's all very much allegorical in terms of
Mhm.
what was going on in the economy, the gold standard, the silver standard, adding more currency to the United States repertoire. Very
Yeah.
interesting. William Jennings Bryan that year becomes a Democratic nominee, only 36 years old. Grover Cleveland supports John M. Palmer, who's a 79-year-old senator from Illinois, and they formed the National Democratic Party, or what eventually became the Bourbon Democrats, which were essentially wanted to go back to the status quo ante, or the status quo where the Democrats were before William Jennings Bryan came on the scene. But Bryan ends up winning the nomination and runs for president 3 times, and now the Democratic Party have conservatives and liberal. And interestingly, this is very similar to what's happened in 2016. In
Right.
2016, the Republican Party had establishment candidates, whether it was Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Jim Gilmore. They were all running for the nomination. Instead, somebody with a divergent ideology and Donald Trump wins the nomination, kind of the new right, a different type of right wing. Consequently, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, the incumbent president, do not endorse their party's nominee. And in 2024, Donald Trump only, of all the people who've been on presidential tickets, Donald Trump only has the endorsement of one person. Do you know who that is?
Well, I don't want to leave a lot of dead air. I'd have to search through.
Sarah Palin.
Oh,
The only person who's been on a presidential ticket who supports Donald Trump, which just shows how he's changed the ideology. So it's very similar to what happened with William Jennings Bryan. In the case of William Jennings Bryan, for 100 years, there were 2 Democratic parties. There's a conservative party for about 60 years, mostly in the South, and then there was the northern and western, more liberal wings, if you will, of the Democratic Party. So the question is, when Donald Trump leaves the scene, stage right, in 2028, whether he wins or he loses, there'll be a new Republican Party nominee. And my guess is there'll be those who want the status quo now, which is under Donald Trump, want that same ideology, J.D. Vance being one of them. And there'll be the folks who want the status quo ante, who want an interventionist foreign policy, who want free trade, who want more
right.
liberal immigration laws. And my guess is in 2028, it's really going to kind of come to a tete-a-tete between the two.
Right. And we have a similar thing happening with the Democrats also, right? Where we have a very progressive branch and we have that center branch. And I think the Middle East has really driven a wedge between those two factions.
Yes, and the Middle East is really, yes, absolutely. So more establishment Democrats, the idea of giving arms to Israel, most Democrats in the United States Congress support that. Vice President Harris and President Biden support that. there is a movement on the left to stop that, and many of those are actually, Jill Stein has kind of become an advocate of that. She wants an arms embargo. And it's interesting because if you go to the primaries in a state like Michigan, about 100,000 people in the state of Michigan in that primary when Joe Biden was basically uncontested voted uncommitted. What does that mean? That means that many of them are Arab and Muslims, and they voted for somebody other than they did not vote for Joe Biden, rather, in the primary because they were disgusted, incensed, or inflamed by what they view as Joe Biden's favoritism toward Israel in the Gaza conflict. So consequently,
Right.
they landed up voting for uncommitted that year around, and it's really kind of a schism within the Democratic Party. Last time around, Joe Biden mustered 86% of the Muslim American vote. There's been polls this time around by the Center for American Islamic Relations, or CARE, that have showed that Jill Stein is actually in a statistical tie with Vice President Harris among Muslim Americans and specifically is leading in the state of Michigan. Now think of that. In the state of Michigan,
Which is a
critical
swing
state,
state.
one of
Yeah.
maybe the three most important states, swing states, with Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And Jill Stein, who's polls about 1 or 2% nationally, is polling upwards of 29% with the Arab and Muslim American communities. And you say that's not many voters, but in a state like Michigan, which is absolutely critical, that could mean quite a lot. So consequently, the Democratic Party, which is doing something I've never seen before, they're running political ads where Jill Stein morphs into Donald Trump, saying that a vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Donald Trump. So they know that Jill Stein can be very perilous to them. They know that she could potentially siphon off voters in the Arab and Muslim American community. So they're trying to kind of get ahead of it, if you will, by running ads attacking Jill Stein. I've never seen them attack a third-party candidate, specifically a third-party candidate that's polling about 1 or 2% nationally.
Right. Fascinating. Do we want to go back into some of the current stuff, or are we ready to go back? How are you thinking our time is going, Bo? We're about an hour in, I think.
Yeah.
So, do we have more juice to squeeze out of this part, you think, Rich?
I think we probably said enough. We could probably go back in time and then weave it in like Donald Trump does.
Right. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Well, I've been ruminating since we first spoke because I knew this show was coming up, and I've been so excited. I will wake up at 5 a.m. and I'm thinking like, oh, and I have to remember to ask, and so what I started to see here was that this is really like a dialogue through history
Yes.
between the rights of the individual and the rights and powers of the collective. And we've talked before on the podcast here about integral theory from Ken Wilber, and he talks about a holon, and he says that a holon is like a person would be a holon, or the idea of a holon is that it's a unit that has selfness, it's a thing in itself, but it also is a part of a greater whole. So it has like two aspects to it. It has its agency out of its thingness, but it also has its participation in the collective by virtue of its partness. And the argument is that everything basically is a holon, right? A plant is a holon, and that's part of that context, that weave of nature and of existence that the Buddhists call dependent originations. Everything came up together. We're all woven together, right? So the human culture seems to be this story about how do we balance those two forces? How do we balance our partness with our neighbors, with our fellow men, and not do injustice to our selfness and our own rights? And this has like been a story. Wow, it goes back all the way, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you can certainly go back to they're modern and ancient. They're ancient and modern philosophers, and you can certainly go back to the ancient philosophy. And at least you can go back to the days of Aristotle, the days of Socrates, talking about virtue ethics. I
And if we can go even farther than that, and we're talking warlords, basically, right? Where it's the power, maybe not of the individual, and I think we've noticed this in chimpanzees, but it's already in chimpanzees, it's the power of a coalition.
Yeah.
So that often the biggest chimp isn't the one that rules, it's the chimp that kind of can manage the coalition because the coalition is always stronger than the individual. And that's sort of the setup here.
What I think is interesting, and I think people often, the question is, how did we get here in terms of having a government? Where did the whole idea come from? And I
Exactly.
think that, and if you read Hobbes and Locke, Hobbes basically said that you start in the state of nature, where human beings, where other species are today, where human beings began. And the state of nature, you have absolute freedom. It's complete anarchy. You can do whatever you want. The problem is that you sacrifice your safety because other people can come, other people can kill you, they can take your food. So you basically come up with, and Thomas Hobbes used to say that the state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short. John
Right.
Locke had a little bit more positive view. Jacques-Jean Rousseau used to talk about how, human beings were kind of born free, but we're in chains everywhere. So,
Everywhere in chains.
yep, we're everywhere in chains. We made an agreement, basically. The idea that you have somebody, that you have a government, that you have a sovereign, was an agreement that mankind made, that they would accede certain rights to that power, that power could tell them certain things that they could not do. For example, you could not steal anything from your neighbor, and in return for that, the sovereign is supposed to guarantee you safety. So
And we refer to
theoretically,
that as the social contract
social
through history.
contract theory. Yep, social contract theory, and that was what John Locke talked about. Hobbes talked about it, and that's why you have government, and that's why Rousseau talked about how we were born free. If you think about it, the human being, and this is certainly true for other species, was in a state of absolute freedom, complete anarchy. You could basically do whatever you wanted. Human beings decided that they wanted longevity, so consequently they said, we want to have we want protection. More important, that's more important to us than freedom. And there's always been this delicate balance between what government can do. Now, someone like a libertarian would say essentially that the federal government should do very little. They should protect you from being hurt by your neighbors, but other than that, you should kind of be on your own. So it's closer to the state of nature. Whereas somebody like a socialist or a progressive would say that the federal government can really do a lot to try to help the human being, to nurture the human being, to make the human being their best self. But that's when it all really, I think, comes down to, is the state of nature, and the fact that most human beings do not want to be a part of the state of nature. Now, that being said, if somebody wanted to move to, say, I mean, there are parts of, there are townships in northern Maine, for example, or central and northern Maine, that you could move to, where you really kind of by yourself. And in that case, you really are, I think, more or less in the state of nature, because if something happens, it probably takes a long time for you to call the cops or to call an authority to come to protect you. Whereas I think if you're living in a city, obviously, then you expect a lot more protection from your federal government.
Right, right. And so we moved from kings, and we get into this experiment. I think that it's fair to say started with the Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea, which is really like I know one of your book is called "Make Every Vote Count." Is that it?
Yep.
What a novel idea!
Yep.
And I kind of wanted to really go into the novelty there. Now, you, of course, were talking about the details of the system that we have currently, about the significance of a vote. But the idea of a vote
Yeah.
itself is kind of a revolutionary thing, isn't it?
It really is. The idea that the human being decides who their sovereign is going to be. The sovereign does not. In a lot of other countries, in Oriental despotism, essentially, it is one person comes, that person dies, and usually it might be the son that takes over. That's what happens in monarchies. In here,
The
people
divine
actually,
right of kings.
absolutely, the divine right of kings. In this country, you actually vote for who that person is going to be, and this goes back to, I guess you go back to Montesquieu. There's a separation of powers. So a president does not have plenary potentiary powers. You have to elect. It's actually six branches, because it's called layer cake federalism. At the federal level, you have a president of the United States, and who is controlling the executive, the entire executive bureaucracy, which is almost a branch of government in and of itself. The president himself probably appoints about 100 people, and then nominates 100 people. Those people then probably nominate or appoint about 10,000 people who are under the president's tutelage, but not really necessarily under his superintendence. But
And now, if he was a king, that's where the story would end.
pretty much, yeah, there would be no Congress, or there would be a Congress that's only job would be to genuflect to the president of the United States. You may have somebody, you may have a body that's only job would be the president comes in and then they kind of ratify it, kind of like a board of trustees in a college, for example, that says, the president has this policy and they just kind of ratify it without a lot of disagreements. Then you have a United States Congress, and in that United States Congress is bicameral. You have two branches. You have one branch, which is the United States Senate, which represents the entire, two members represent the entire state. So a state like Wyoming, which has less than 700,000 people, has the same amount of senators as a state like California. And then you have the United States Congress, and you have congressional districts, and you have 435 voting members, plus about six
Right.
non-voting members from territories and Indian tribes. So that's what you have. And then on the state level, you have an executive branch, a judiciary, even the judiciary at the federal as well, a judiciary branch, which Alexander Hamilton used to call the least dangerous branch, and a legislative branch as well. So you really have 6 branches of government.
Right. But I want to go back one click back, because you mentioned that we had the group or the congressional gathering that might just genuflect to
Right.
the king. But we didn't just transition over to those guys getting a real say, did we? We had this whole thing that had to happen, and they had to kind of hold a knife to the king's throat, didn't they, to get that power?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And
With
then the king has to
the Magna Carta, I guess that was?
1215. Yep, 1215.
Yeah. And that was like, again, another kind of a revolution.
And then from there, if you go to the United States history, eventually you get to the point where, and you get to what I think is really kind of in many respects, the beginning of the United States government. You have this Mayflower Compact. So when they're on the Mayflower, the voyagers make this agreement, and their agreement for the better ordering they set of individuals, they basically had what I would say is a direct democracy. You didn't really necessarily have leaders. It was more just people making their own choice. You go through the Virginia Rights of Man, and eventually you go from a revolution, or a gradual revolution, that is, from that to the democratic republic or the constitutional republic that we have today. But certainly there were no checks and balances. And it's interesting that I think that form of government, direct democracy, can work in very small doses. In New England, there's called town meetings, where for lots of things, when they to approve the town budgets, for example, they all get together in a gathering room, and they caucus and they make the agreement. But obviously, that would be very hard to do in an entire state or an entire nation, if you will.
Right. And now, as soon as those guys got power, a little bit of power away from the king, an interesting thing started to happen, didn't it? They started to separate into two groups.
Yes.
That we now identify. And it's interesting because this goes all the way back to the French kings, where in the I guess the throne room on the right side would sit all of the people that supported the king.
Oh, yeah.
And on the left side would be all the people that kind of had a bone to pick with him. And that's where we get this left-right idea, right?
Right. And now it's so confusing what left is and what right is that it's become to the point where it's in the eye of the beholder. But that was originally why they had to sit left and right. It's not that there is necessarily some congenital, people are congenital use of that term. But it's interesting because you go to the point in terms of left and right, you go to the point where left meets right, because politics is not a continuum. You don't keep going so far to conservative, so far. Eventually, you start to come back, and you start to have a point where right and left meet. And that's why when it comes to non-interventionism, for example, somebody like Ron Paul or Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, who's very much to the right, is very much simpatico ideologically with somebody like Jill Stein. That's why somebody like AOC, for example, the progressive caucus, and as well as the Freedom Caucus on the right, agreed on trying to curtail funding for the Ukraine, for example. So it's very interesting what left is and kind of what right is, and it's so confusing. Right. I don't blame anybody for seeing the incongruities of everything ideologically.
Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
That's like the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan when the U.S. teamed up with them. to try to take on Al Qaeda, there were a bunch of factions that basically did not like the Taliban, but that didn't necessarily mean that meant that they necessarily liked each other. They just had different interests, and that's what kind of brought them together.
Right, right. So, I hear a lot now, and I mean, there's some truth to it, where there's a lot of rancor between these two sides, and I've heard people say, "Oh, it's never been this bad." And I always think, well, there was that time when we were like shooting cannons at each other. That's got to be in there somewhere. But we can go even farther back, because when we talk about this polarity that happens as soon as the people start to get a little power away from the elites, they start to separate. And in England, they were called Whigs and Tories, weren't they?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
now, I was doing some research here just to do my due diligence, and what I found out, I just love. This is one of my favorite things I found out about this: that the name Whigs and the name Tories were totally insults. That Whig was short for Whigamore, and they were cattle drovers from Western Scotland, and it was considered a total insult to call somebody a Whig, while a Tory was a robber or a thief. And so now that we hear one side calling another side garbage, and and people are like, "Oh no, this has never happened." It's like, well, actually, it's kind of a tradition. We're just maybe not used to it to see it the way that we see it nowadays with technology and everything. But that idea of the Whigs and the Tories, that translated across to America in the beginning, didn't it?
Yes, and it's interesting because you talk about the political insults, for example, and political insults have been there for time immemorial. Woodrow Wilson used to say that the United States Congress has a bungalow mind. Gerald Ford Lyndon Johnson used to say about Gerald Ford that he's a nice guy, but he played too much. He played too much football without his helmet on. Um, Congressman Marion Barry once, when he was arguing with Adam Putnam, who was a congressman from Florida with red hair, and he called him a howdy doody looking Nimrod on the House floor. Gene Taylor, congressman from Mississippi, the Americans for Tax Reform, said that he had supported the Obama health care plan. He wrote him a letter and he said that he didn't support him. He called him and in his press release, he called him a lying sacks of scum. So, I mean, this has been going on, really. Insults have been going on for time immemorial, and that's really kind of part and parcel, if you will, of the American experiment, I think. I don't think it's
Right.
anything
And,
unusual.
and I remember seeing that they had a line down the middle of the House of Parliament.
Yep.
And the idea was that, and this is kind of this idea of the bicameral House, which again is a manifestation of that dichotomy between the interests of the people at large and the interests of maybe the elites. And I was told that the line down the middle was to keep sword fights from breaking out, that you couldn't step across the line in the middle of the room.
Well, you did have. It's interesting because you did have, essentially a senator came in. You have had physical violence in the past in the United States Senate, certainly, and it happened during the Civil War. But of course, I mean, we go through these cycles, have these cycles of extreme division, and then you have times after that that's usually kind of peace and prosperity and somewhat unified. And I look, for
Right.
example, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, where time Calvin Coolidge was elected. Warren G. Harding was elected overwhelmingly, 60% of the vote. About Calvin Coolidge would succeed him as president. Won overwhelmingly 1924, extremely popular. Probably could have won re-election had he run again in 1928. Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s was extremely popular. There were some recessions, and there was certainly the Cold War, but generally there was time of peace and prosperity.
Mhm.
After the 20s, by the way, what came next? The Great Depression and World War II. After the 50s, what came next? The race riots in Vietnam. The 1990s, a lot of peace and prosperity. Bill Clinton had record job approval rating, reelected overwhelmingly, left with a 66% job approval rating, higher than any president in American history. And then what comes after that? You have 9/11, and then you have the war in Iraq. So certainly, I think that you have decades of kind of where people can be very depoliticized, and the issues that we were debating. You
Right.
just go back to the 1990s, for example. The
Mhm.
question and part of the questions in the 1996 election between Bob Dole and Bill Clinton was, Should the federal budget be balanced in 10 years or 8 years? And should it be budgeted by using scoring from the Office of Management and Budget or the or the Congressional Budget Office? I mean, these are the issues
Right.
that we dealt with. Then there was the constitutionality of the line item veto. I mean, that was a big issue. What should we give to the IMF? These were the issues we were debating in 1997, 1998, and then all of a sudden, you get into these eras where you get a lot more divided. But I mean, for time
Right.
immemorial, politicians they're very good rhetorically, and there's always been insults politically, and I really don't see this. I don't see this minimizing.
Yeah.
Rich, you're talking about cycles of kind of greater divide. Um, and we were talking before the show about, are these cycles or is this a spiraling? Meaning,
Good question.
what kind of progression do we see in these cycles, if any?
That's a great question. And I think it's more a lateral thing. I think you just go through cycles where you have everything's going perfectly, people are making money in the stock market, and then something happens afterward. And I don't see a scenario where you have a scenario like in the 1920s, people were buying stock on margin. I mean, everyone thought that the good times were just going to roll. There was no major foreign conflicts overseas, at least where the United States was sending ground troops. 1950s, you had the Cold War, and the Cold War was certainly raging on. You had, Russians invading Hungary, for example. But generally speaking, people were kind of living their lives. The same thing in the 1990s. But it seems to be lateral. I don't think where you see a progression where you can see a point where there's been, say, 20 or 30 years of general peace and prosperity. Something almost always matriculates.
Yeah. I was thinking of the period between 1816 and 1824.
Oh, the era of good feelings.
The
Yes,
era of
James
good feelings.
actually,
Is that not great?
yes, that's James Monroe. And James
Uh-huh.
Monroe in 1820 basically ran without opposition. And in 1822, his party, the Democratic Republican Party, picked up seats in 1822 in the House of Representatives. That was it was a 6 year of a presidency. Do you know the next time that a president's party picked up seats in the House of Representatives in a 6 year of their presidency?
I can't imagine.
Bill Clinton in
Yeah. Bill
1998.
Clinton. Okay.
That was
That's
1822, very similar, peace and prosperity under James Monroe. And then Bill Clinton, peace and prosperity, 1998. There was also a backlash against the impeachment movement, but that was the era of good feelings. You're absolutely right about that, and that was a time I think James Monroe and Bill Clinton basically presided over general peace and prosperity. So that would be one. But what happened after that was, I guess it took a while, but eventually you had certainly Andrew Jackson's very contentious presidency, and then by 1837 you had the
right.
Panic of 1837, which really helped to do in Martin Van Buren.
Right. And now Andrew Jackson is an interesting one to mention in this conversation because you mentioned earlier, which I think a lot of people might not have understood, that there was a Democratic Republican Party.
Yes, yes. This comes out of George Washington was the first president, and he warned about in his farewell address. He didn't actually deliver the address, by the way. It was just in newspapers about the baleful existence of political parties. But
Exactly.
that being said, there's nothing in the word political party is nowhere in the Declaration of Independence, nowhere in the Articles of Federation, nowhere in the Constitution, by the way. But in his administration, there was division. There was John Adams, the vice president, helped to form the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary as well, which basically wanted a larger role for the federal government.
So these would be comparable to the people that were on the side of the king, like the Tories.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say, and then Thomas Jefferson formed the Democratic Republican Party, which wanted a smaller role for the federal government. But you have to go back a little bit further in American history because
So
it's
the
not talked
Articles
about.
of Confederation?
The Articles of Confederation, Perpetual Union, yes. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution of the United States. And it really limited the federal government. You needed all 13 states to raise taxes, for example, to go to war. You needed the states' approval for just about everything. They had a president. It was called the Office of President of Congress Assembled, but that was really a member of the Constitutional Convention. So you had, for example, John Hancock, you had John Hanson Jr., and they'd serve for about a year. This really limited the role of government. Then,
And they were presidents in that they were presiding over
yes,
the meeting, but not like necessarily having vast powers of executive
it was more like
ability.
the Speaker of the House.
Right. That's what I meant.
It was more a lot. They did have some powers. For example, in 1782, John Hanson approved the first Treasury Department and the first presidential seal. But what happened was in 1787, there was some talk about people were saying this is untenable. There wasn't a big enough role. The federal government doesn't have any responsibilities. We need to simply amend it. So that was the purpose of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And what happens? They meet that hot summer and they come out with a completely different document, the United States Constitution. The Constitution provides for a larger role for the federal government. It provides for three branches of government. It provides for taxes being levied. It provides for a lot of things that the federal government did. It was basically, even though, so what happened at the time was there was a debate, and the folks who supported this new constitution, which the other people believe was illegal because that wasn't their mission, wrote what was called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist
Right.
Papers were basically basically tried to promote the idea of why we need a new constitution. Then there were the Anti-Federalist Papers. Those were people that favored the previous constitution that said we need to keep the Articles of Confederation. And their argument, these were the conservatives at the time. Their argument was the new constitution is going to present too big of a role rather for the federal government. These two ideas clashed. There was the Federalists so now you have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanted less role of the federal government. They wanted to keep the Constitution, which is very ironic because today conservatives will often say, or libertarians, we're constitutionalists. We want to keep the Constitution. We want to protect the Constitution. The Constitution protects small government. It actually, at the time, the conservatives would have been the ones who said, we want to continue the Articles of Confederation or Perpetual Union. The more liberals or progressives would have been those who said, we need a new constitution. We need this constitution. So it's really kind of changed. And if you really want to be a conservative, you could say, let's have another constitutional convention and go back to the Articles of Confederation. Now,
Right. And in fact, though, isn't the Constitution as we have it now kind of a genius document in that it balances those two? Because all those folks that were behind the Articles of Confederation and into limiting federal power, weren't they the ones responsible for the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution?
yes, so they made an agreement between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. And some of them, like Elbridge Gerry, for example, in Massachusetts, still voted against it because they still thought the Constitution, as Patrick Henry said, it squints toward, his fear was, he said, it has an awful squinting, it squints toward monarchy. That was part of the fear. And they did create the Constitution. They put the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, but there were still some Anti-Federalists who were very much opposed to the idea of the Constitution.
Sure.
And
Now,
many of
can I
them,
pause there?
yep,
And just to interject that this was not a new thought, this fear of monarchy, wasn't it? Because I remember Plato talking about how when a democracy dies, it does so by turning into an oligarchy,
yes.
which is to say that it kind of reverts to a power game, or like a monarchy was.
And
So
Aristotle
these
kind of,
guys were standing on history a little bit when they had that argument, weren't they?
oh, absolutely. And Aristotle, too. Aristotle did not think a democracy was the best form of government. He saw more of kind of an amalgamation, he had about 6 different regimes that he talked about. And he thought that a polity, which was kind of an amalgamation of all of the forms of government, was the best form. But he definitely saw the deleterious potential effects, if you will, in democracy. And I think Plato rather certainly did as well.
Yeah.
So Jefferson forms this new political party, the Democratic Republican Party, and then there's a Federalist. Jefferson in 1796 rather, John Adams is elected president. Thomas Jefferson is elected vice president because at the time, before the Constitutional Amendment, it was in the Electoral College, it was whoever wins becomes president, whoever comes in second place becomes vice president.
Vice president, right.
So that's why you had that scenario. Then in 1800, you have what's called the Revolution of 1800. And in that presidential election, John Adams is running as a Federalist. And for the first time, you have somebody that wants to really limit the size of government winning the presidential election. And that was Thomas Jefferson. And he ushered in an era of Democratic Republicans, from himself to Madison and then to James Monroe, the 3 Virginians, if you will. and they all basically
Right.
subscribe to that Democratic Republican theory of governing.
Right. Which was not the Democratic or the Republican Party of today.
No, but the Democratic Republican Party would be closer to the Republican Party or the Libertarian Party. And I think that the Federalist Party would be closer to the Democratic Party, but obviously,
Right.
it's not a direct translation.
And that brings us to Andrew Jackson, who was really the father of the current incarnation of the Democratic Party. Is that fair to say?
Yes, but with help of Martin Van Buren, but he would not recognize the Democratic Party of today. Andrew
Yeah,
Jackson was
absolutely.
somebody who wanted very much a limited role of federal government. One thing he did do, though, is from Washington to Jackson, every president, first of all, basically believed that that the president should only veto bills they viewed as unconstitutional. So they would agree with something and they would still sign that bill. Jackson began the process of vetoing bills that he personally did not like or thought was injudicious for the United States. So
Interesting.
he changed it in that respect. And also, folks like Thomas Jefferson basically believed that the federal government, that the president should be subservient to the United States Congress. That they should just kind of sign what the Congress gives them. Jackson came in and had a completely different ideology. His ideology was there should be an activist president. This, I guess, the beginning of what we could call the modern incarnation of the American presidency, and that the federal government should have a larger role. So Andrew Jackson comes in, and they do form. You're right, the Democratic Party. Part of that was in 1831. Actually, William Wirt was the nominee of what was called the Anti-Masonic Party. They were anti-Masons. They had their first political convention in American history, and that was in 1831. The next year, the Democratic Party followed suit and held their own convention, which was the first real convention.
Okay.
Jackson serves for 2 terms, and then Martin Van Buren comes in, and Martin Van Buren was extremely conservative. He was the first. Jackson and Van Buren were the first 2 Democratic presidents, and Martin Van Buren comes in, and there's a Panic of 1837, and he sells the White House tools so that they could not be used for federal government projects to try to stimulate the economy. That's how conservative Martin Van Buren was.
Well,
Rich, I just want to go back for a moment. I was really surprised. I obviously don't know American history like you do. Surprised to hear you say anti-Masonic party because I thought that Masons were primarily like, any ideology that went with Masonic tradition was kind of underground. I didn't know that publicly Masons were much more than a craft guild. Can you fill
Yes,
me in
and
on
let
that?
me add a little bit. Let me add another section of that question, because the anti-Masonic guys, they were also came into cahoots with the Free Soilers and the Know
know
Nothings
nothings.
and all
Yes.
that. There's a whole thing there, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
this is fascinating. The know nothing. First of all, Okay, so the Free Soil. Let's back up. For the Free Soil Party, they were part. But when the Whigs started to there were part of them were kind of
Or
disaffected
Whigs.
Whigs. Some of them were Democrats who were against expanding slavery into the new territories, and some of
Yeah.
them eventually became Republicans. And in 1848, they actually nominated former President Martin Van Buren, who had a difference of his party with the Democratic Party over slavery. So he gradually left the Democratic Party, formed that political party, and they actually won 10.1% of the popular vote in the 1848 presidential election. Then you have the Know Nothing Party. They're actually called the American Party. So why are they called the Know Nothing Party? Because when they would have secret conventions. Yes, yes, yes. They would have secret conventions, and when people would ask members what they talked about, they would say, "I know nothing." So they became the Know Nothing Party. And in 1856, Millard Fillmore, who had been president from 1850 to 1853, respectively, was unknowingly their party's nominee. He was away, he was overseas, and they told him that he was going to be their presidential nominee that year. And he actually won the state of Maryland. In 11 states. He came in second in that presidential election. They were very much against Irish immigration. They're called the American Party. And actually, in Massachusetts, at one point, they had the governorship, the entire congressional delegation, and almost the entire state legislature. And gradually, all these parties, the Free Soilers, the disaffected Democrats, and the Whig Party, eventually, after Millard Fillmore left after Millard Fillmore left office, really kind of disbanded. They all kind of came in and they became the Republican Party. And in
With the
1856,
Anti-Masonic Party.
part of the Anti-Masonic Party, part of the members of that party became Republicans. And in 1856, by the way, by then Millard Fillmore was not really not necessarily really a know nothing. He didn't really believe in their ideology, but they wanted somebody who had name recognition, so they chose him as their nominee, and he didn't really have much choice of the matter. He didn't really campaign either. But in 1856, John C. Fremont was the first Republican presidential nominee, and they all kind of unified toward them. And then in 1860, they nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. Lincoln was really a kind of a underdog, but he won the nomination. And then in 1864, there was a falling out, and John C. Fremont was seriously considering running for president as a third party that year. And he thought that Abraham Lincoln was too soft on slavery because he only wanted to outlaw it in the new territories, not where it had already existed. So he was going to form this third party. And then finally, in the last minute, he wrote a letter saying that he believed that he would be a spoiler and would siphon votes away from Lincoln, and that he would elect General George McClellan instead. So consequently, he egressed from the race.
Now do the Masonic part.
They are okay. So now you go back to the Anti-Masonic Party. They basically believe they were very much out in the open in 1830. They were a third party though, so they were not at the same level as the Democratic Republican Party or the Federalist Party were, or the Democratic Party. But they were certainly existed. They had a convention and they nominated somebody for president, and that was the beginning of the idea of having a political convention. And they did it a full year before the actual presidential election. They did it in 1831. And they nominated William Wirt, who actually served about 12 years as Attorney General.
What did they stand for, Rich? What the Masonic Party?
That was
It was
Go ahead.
the Anti-Masonic.
The
Well, I'm
Anti-Masonic Party.
curious what the Masons stood for that the Anti-Masonic Party was against.
That's a good question. I just know that they were against the idea of Masons, and they believed in all sorts of conspiracies, as really did the Know-Nothings in terms of Irish immigration. They were kind of a reactionary type of a group, I can tell you that.
Okay.
Well, and if there's a lot of people that aren't telling you what they're talking about, it almost verges on secret societies, which I'm sure was also
Illuminati.
a question for the government to try. How do we insulate ourselves from pernicious influences? So that
Yes,
was probably part of that idea, right?
absolutely. And it's always and this has been from time immemorial, it's always about the other. And people have a
Catholicism at one point.
Catholicism. Yep, people always have a skepticism toward the other.
So speaking of immigration, that came up a couple of times now, and we talked earlier about kind of American history moving through these cycles. And obviously, immigration is a huge topic in the current election. I don't want to take us away from history too much, but I'm curious to ask how or what do you interpret from how the um, reaction to immigration has evolved over time, which seems to have some cycles to it also. And do you have any thoughts about where we are today relative to immigration? You know, as part of that cycling or spiraling.
Yeah, there was always an anti-immigration sentiment in the country for the groups coming in, whether it was the Chinese, whether it was Italians. You had certainly Sacco and Vanzetti trial in Massachusetts. By the way, acting Governor Paul Cellucci eventually landed up pardoning both of them. For these were two anarchists, and they were Italian immigrants that had come to the country. I think that what modern day skeptics of immigration would say, and this is the case they would always make, is we don't mind people coming the right way. What we don't want is people cutting the line and coming illegally. And that's basically why it's different than people that, for example, in the past, they would say, well, there are too many people coming when we need, and they're going to essentially try to take the jobs away from Americans. There are some, Pat Buchanan's one, who talks about a moratorium on all immigration, meaning that we should essentially see who's here now, and we should get rid of we should not allow anybody new to come into the country. I think folks, even Donald Trump would say foundationally that we need that is, if you come legally, that's okay. The question obviously is for those who are trying to come over. Obviously, for a lot of them, it's a long process to get a visa, and it's a long process too to try to get if they do come over, rather to try to get asylum. Some of them are staying in the country in the meantime. So that's where I think the kind of differentiation would be in terms of I think very few people would take the Pat Buchanan view today that we should just stop, have a complete moratorium on not only illegal but legal immigration concurrently.
And
We'd have
and
to have a moratorium on birth control if we did
Yeah,
that, wouldn't
yeah.
we?
and maybe this is a little bit of a hot button topic. I don't really know how to think about it, Rich, but there's some of the rhetoric from the right um, says that illegal immigration, especially combined with a lack of voter ID requirement, could tip more municipalities or states towards the Democrats, and that maybe this is intentional, maybe not. But do you see that influencing the 2024 election and future elections? Like I think Elon Musk
Great question.
in the talks he's been giving on the
Mhm.
campaign trail with Trump is saying if Trump doesn't win, this is the last election, and that's what he means by that. Is that that illegal immigration plus a lack of voter ID will result in Democrats winning the Electoral College kind of by default. Is
Well,
that real?
it's interesting because on the other side of that, a lot of Democrats say that they believe that if Donald Trump were to lose the election, I mean, were to win the election, that this would be the last election because he told Sean Hannity that he would be a dictator on day one, that he wouldn't be a dictator. So they're saying that, well, he'd actually be a dictator. So that's what kind of the left kind of thinks of the right. I don't know how much of an effect that actually is. That's kind of, there's this whole theory called the Great Replacement Theory that essentially white Anglo-Saxons are going to be gradually supplanted by immigrants, specifically those coming from Central America and South American countries, South America, and that they are going to become the new Americas, and and the new Americans are going to become voters, and that once they become voters, they are going to vote for the Democratic presidential nominee. I will say there are about, and currently there are about 63 million Latinos living in the country legally, and about 43 million of those are Mexicans. And it is true that Latinos tend to vote Democrat. But that being said, obviously Latinos are not a Latinos are not a monolith. I wouldn't necessarily count on the entire Latino community voting Democrat. George W. Bush, for example, when he ran for re-election as governor of Texas in 1998, won 49% of the Latino vote. Rick Perry did very well with the Latino vote in Texas, running for governor. Greg Abbott's done very well with that group. My guess is that theoretically, if Latinos were to come over, I think the first few generations, if they were to become citizens, would probably vote Democrat. But then after a while, assuming the parties are the same, are at homeostasis, they would probably go. Some of them would vote Republican, and they would get a little bit more competitive. Even this election, Latinos have become more and more competitive. They're not as monolithic as, say, the African American vote is for the Democratic Party.
Well, the Latino culture is very religious.
Yes, that's why a lot of
And-
them,
and
issues like abortion rights, for example, many of them would be opposed to that, and that's why you would think that a lot of those Latinos coming over from Central and South America. But this is again where incongruities begin, I guess, because they may be very religious, but there also can be some of the more, and this is the same thing where African Americans, when you ask African Americans questions about social issues, for example, they say in the polls are some of the most conservative people, yet they vote Democrat because they're voting more for economic issues than they are for social issues. So you do see that. Another issue would be Muslims. Muslims are considered very conservative in terms of religious, in terms of going by the Quran. But then, if you look at how they vote in the United States, they vote for some of the most liberal candidates who are not very socially conservative whatsoever. So this is where this kind of incongruities come in.
yeah, fascinating. And now, we've talked about the theme between the populists, let's say, the Whigs, and the elitists, the Tories or the Federalists, what used to be the Republicans. But there's also another dichotomy that goes down here, and that's the one, you know, the Democratic Republicans back in the days of Jefferson, they tended to be farmers, I think,
Yes.
right?
Oh, agrarian republic. Absolutely.
And the Federalists tended to be more urban.
Yes, absolutely.
And if we look at a map today, that's not that's not gone away. There's clearly still quite a separation between the urban issues, values, worldview, concerns, and the rural.
And it's
Um,
yep. Go ahead.
so please speak to that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting because rural voters used to be the bread and butter of the Democratic Party. The last time that the state of Nebraska, since 1936 has only voted for a Republican, for a Democrat once. That was LBJ in 1964. Franklin Roosevelt won it in 1936, 1932 as well, because it was a rural state. He did very well in rural parts of the country. They had problems in urban areas. When Jimmy Carter ran in 1976, he did very well in a lot of the southern accented counties, in places like Georgia, like Florida, like Tennessee. It's gradually become based on values issues, I guess, that rural voters have become more and more conservative, more and more Republican. Urban voters. Calvin Coolidge won New York City in 1924. He won all five boroughs of New York City. Cities have gradually gone to the Democratic Party. Obviously, there's some exceptions
right,
for rural voters. Places like, for example, where for rural Vermont is very, except for the Northeast Kingdom, is very much Democratic because it's very much old hippies that have kind of moved over there, or Western Massachusetts, the Berkshires, if you will, is very
right,
Democratic because there are colleges out there. So it's a little different culture. And then the cities, places like, if you go to somewhere like Amarillo, Texas, for example, you're not going to find a lot of long-haired liberals. I mean, those are very conservative places. Provo City, Utah. Provo, Utah would be another one. Certainly Abilene, Texas, West Texas, where oil is very important. So there are exceptions for
yep,
that. But generally speaking, this is the Democrat strategy, is to try to maximize their votes in the city, bring as many people out in urban areas, generally speaking now, and then they want to try to win suburban communities, or at least tie in suburban communities, and then try to minimize the damage they would have in some of the rural communities. Republicans, on the other hand, it's all a matter of trying to maximize their support in rural communities, try to somehow tie or win in suburban communities, and then to be victorious in the rural communities by wide margins.
right. And is it fair to say that this is kind of what powers the issues nowadays to look at the electoral college complications, let's call them? And I know that there's arguments on both sides. And the argument, of course, that I hear from the rural side is that the people in the cities aren't going to, if they have too much power, they'll make decisions uh, that don't benefit those in the rural setting.
Well,
Um,
the
Go ahead and
interesting
speak to
the
that. Yeah.
interesting thing though is the rural voters, a lot of them are very much ignored currently. You go for a state like, for example, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Idaho have not gone for a Democrat since LBJ's landslide in 1964, and really haven't been competitive since then. So consequently, there's no reason for any candidate to go to that state. That's a very rural state where, this really is no reason for a candidate to go there. Now, if you go to if you let's take it to a state, let's take it to a state, for example. George W. Bush, Rick Perry won the state of Texas and were reelected in the state of Texas as governor without winning big cities like Austin, Dallas, and Houston, for example, because they did very well in the rural parts of the state. So I think that if they were to go to popular vote, I think that places like Idaho, and would presidential candidates go to a place like Idaho? Probably not, because it'd just be inconsequential. But that being said, there would be get out the vote movements, just like there are get out the vote movements in small towns in places like rural Texas, because a vote in a rural part of Texas is tantamount to a vote in a city in Texas. Small state right now, it's really fascinating scenario where small states and large states are both ignored. California, Texas, and Florida are completely ignored, and New York, the four biggest states in the country. No candidate has
Because
any
it's a
chance.
done deal.
And they're completely ignored. The only time people go into those states, they go there, they raise money, then they spend the money in places like Wisconsin. But small states are ignored too. Idaho, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota. Again, there's no reason for a presidential candidate to go there. Democratic small states like Delaware and Rhode Island, there's no reason for a presidential candidate to campaign there either. So the states that tend to benefit the most are the medium-sized states. But I've
Right.
never seen a scenario like this. Probably in 1980, I think there were about 10 swing states. This time around, there are literally 7 states that are actually showdown states. So, I mean, all this effort is being poured into places like Wisconsin, a small state like Nevada, 5 electoral votes. Vice President Harris was in Reno, Donald Trump was in Las Vegas, and they're both trying to get those 5 electoral votes. Obviously, there are lots of larger states and there are a lot more people in the country, but all the money that the candidates tend to be spending are to go to small states. Now, that being said, Donald Trump did visit New York, and he visited Madison Square Garden, trying to think that he tries to I think he views this more as a national election almost, and figures any coverage he could get from going to New York City would certainly filter into places like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania,
Right.
or
Well,
like
that was my next question because it used to be that politicians would get on a train, wouldn't they?
Harry Truman
And
did
they'd
that.
and
Ferdinand
they
Magellan, he probably reached about 3 million voters in 1948 and pulled out maybe one of the biggest upsets in presidential history.
and they would give their speeches from the back of the train,
Yep.
right? The the balcony at the back of the train, and as soon as then the train rolls and we're on to the next town. But now we have this technology that lets us have this meeting from literally nearly opposite sides of the country.
Oh, it's
In fact, it is now the opposite sides of the country because Bo is over in the political science department of Berkeley.
the hotbed of conservatism that it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, by
And
by
so you
coincidence, I'm in my brother's office. He's a professor here at UC Berkeley in the political science department. So I kind of feel honored sitting here and talking to you today, Rich.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you.
Well, so do you think that this technology is? I mean, we know that, for example, when Kennedy got on the television, that was like a bullet to Kennedy's head, right?
Oh,
Uh,
no,
technologically,
no pun intended, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so now we have this whole new IT revolution. I mean, I literally was talking to somebody in Uganda this morning,
Amazing.
like radical. I think we can easily call it hyper novelty these times. So, what do you think about the impact of technology in general, as well as on this idea of the flyover states and the ones that are really important? Because we're all kind of like in this cyber world together now in a new way. All right, maybe we're not together, but we're in the same cyber world.
Oh, it is fascinating, and you have places, very rural counties. There still is kind of the digital divide, and there are parts of the country that do not necessarily have the technology that the urban areas have, and I think they're trying to ameliorate that gradually. Go back, Bill Clinton used to talk about that in the '90s, the digital divide. So I think it certainly is an issue, but I think that part of the reason we have this with modern technology, Donald Trump's strategy by going to places like New York City is to say, I'm going to go there. I'm going to get a lot of people that are going to watch this, and then people that are watching in places like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan are going to turn on the television set. And there's going to be as much coverage of me in New York City as if I was in Traverse City, Michigan, for example. That's a
Right.
strategy. It's kind of a risky strategy. It's an unorthodox strategy. Um, I never really seen any candidates do this. I mean, I will say that Vice President Harris did make one stop in Texas, which is not a swing state, so that is kind of interesting. Maybe she figures that her stop in Texas will somehow
Right.
get some media attention in places like Nevada and Arizona. And Donald Trump was in Europe, your neck of the woods. He's been to New Mexico, and New
He was
Mexico
just here yesterday.
since
Yeah.
1992, New Mexico has gone for the Democratic every presidential candidate every single year, except for John Kerry losing it to Bush in 2004. So I think he thinks maybe that he goes to New Mexico, he's going to get some support in the Latino community, and it's going to filter into places like Arizona and like Nevada.
Right. And of course, go ahead. I was just going to say we can't talk about technology without talking about the Trump Rogan long
Oh yes,
form interview. And that's a change in media, isn't it? This long form thing, which of course I'm a complete a fan of, but that's changing the media landscape again, isn't it?
yes, oh absolutely, and the fact that you can have a presidential candidate or a president go to somebody's studio and sit there and talk for that many hours. And I would say on the other side of that, you have Howard Stern, for example, interviewing Vice President Harris and doing a long form interview. And who would have thought, for example, 15 years ago, when Howard Stern was seen as kind of the bad boy of radio, that he would now have major presidential candidates on. He used to kind of make fun of Don Imus because Don Imus would have kind of another person with New Mexico ties would have kind of the major presidential candidates on. He used to say, and he used to have people that were more in the entertainment industry. Now, someone like Howard Stern can do a full form interview with Joe Biden and with Vice President Harris. And I think by doing that, I think you're becoming more and more mainstream, and maybe you kind of lose some of the audience, some of the people that want it to be more, have him to be more of kind of just a shock jock and somebody who's kind of anti-establishment. Now he's interviewing people from the establishment.
Right.
Rich, I want to go back to the urban rural theme because I think there's really a lot to that. Brian and I did an episode that hasn't come out yet, but it will in a couple of weeks about the American West and kind of like the values of the American West. I mean, that's been a little bit of a theme for us, both of us coming from the Northeast, kind of New York City, and ending up in rural New Mexico. And I think, one of the themes around that is the Electoral College, and
Yes.
and it it's one of these issues like the filibuster that keeps coming up as, well, it's not fair and we should abolish it. But as urbanization continues to increase, it seems like the Electoral College becomes more and more important to kind of balance the values and the needs and the kind of voting inclinations of the middle of the country relative to the coasts. But I don't know why the Electoral College was initially installed. And was that the intent, was to create that rural urban balance? And does it still work for that? Um, and yeah, what else should we know about the Electoral College?
Well, if we go back to 1787, they really couldn't come up with an agreement in terms of the Constitutional Convention how presidents should be elected. Folks like James Wilson, who wanted the unitary executive theory, had his own views. Some of them wanted the congressional delegations to choose, state legislatures to choose. Some of them thought that there should be a national popular vote. Eventually they said, we'll just give this power to the states. So the states basically, it's the constitutional the Constitution says each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct the number of electors. That's all it says. What does that mean? That means essentially that the states have plenary authority to award their electoral votes any way they choose, and it's a misapprehension to say that they met that it has always been that every state chooses their nominee on whoever wins their state. If you go back to the first election, for example, only 3 states actually awarded their electoral votes to whoever won their state. It was the Democratic Republican Party, which was dominating certain state capitals, that wanted to dominate at the presidential level as well. In some of the states that started making it so that the person who wins the popular vote in the state wins the entire state. So if you win by one vote in the state, you win everything. But that the states have plenary authority to award their electoral vote any way they choose. If they want to choose the tallest person in the state to be the electors, they can do that. So there's actually a movement, and it's called the National Popular Vote Movement. And it started by John Cause, and he actually invented the scratch-off lottery ticket. He's out in California. And his idea is that there should be an interstate compact. And actually, a lot of states have agreed to it so far. Michigan, Maine, Massachusetts, a lot of states have agreed to it. And it says that we will award our electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote, but we'll only do it when enough states who represent the requisite 270 electoral votes, which is what you need out of 538 votes in the Electoral College, agree to do it. So, in other words, it would not, if take a state like Massachusetts, for example, Massachusetts, which has agreed to the compact, would say, we're going to award our electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote, not to whoever wins Massachusetts. So essentially, it's a way of getting there without having a constitutional amendment. Other states, Nebraska and Maine, do it a different way. In Nebraska and Maine, whoever wins the state gets 2 electoral votes for the 2 senators they have. Then it comes down to congressional districts. So in the state of Nebraska, they have 3 congressional districts. 2 of them are demonstrably conservative and are going to go for Trump almost invariably. Then there's what's called the Blue Dot District, which is right around the area. It's actually represented by Congressman Bacon. And that's a swing district. It's Omaha, and Omaha is very much of a college community. Consequently, there are many Democrats there. So as a result, Tim Walz, even though it only has 1 electoral vote, because it's a swing county, Tim Walz has actually been there twice so far. Maine, very similar. Maine, 2 electoral votes to whoever wins the state, which is almost surely going to be of a Democrat. Then the first congressional district of Maine, which is very small, right around here, is going to go for the Democratic nominee. Then you have a second congressional district, which is the biggest one from the east of Mississippi, which goes all the way down from Lewiston and Auburn over here up to places like Bangor and Augusta, then all those townships, and way the way up to Fort Kent, Presque Isle, and Caribou. And that's a very much of a swing district. So consequently, Tim Walz's wife, for example, has visited there, and it's a state, and it's both of those districts are getting political advertising. So that's one way that they can do it. But it's very interesting when you have a system where big states and small states, both of the same self-interest from a self-interest standpoint, are completely ignored, and swing states, 7 states, get the majority of the coverage. By the way, the swing states tend to move. Go back to 2000, for example. Arkansas, Tennessee, West Virginia were all swing states. Now, if any candidate were to campaign in there, it would be a political fool's errand to go to a state like that. So it changes. 1976 in Texas, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter campaigned there the day before the election because it was very much of a swing state. Texas was a swing state in '68 when Lyndon Johnson campaigned in Houston at the Metrodome for Hubert Humphrey. So it really does kind of change what the swing states are. Ohio, Florida, and Iowa were all swing states last time. This time, neither of them are swing states. And Virginia used to, in 1976, Jimmy Carter won the entire South with only losing one state, and that was the state of Virginia because it was the most conservative state in the South. Now Virginia is becoming more and more of a Democratic state. So it does change. It's usually it's probably more like 13 or 14 states, but we've never had a scenario since 1980 where it's only been about 7 states that are actually showdown states.
Right, right.
And in terms of speaking of process, I'm just curious: is there any precedent for Harris winning the Democrat nomination without having participated in a primary? Is that
Yeah.
normal? Because I mean, I've heard that called a coup, and I don't know how to think about that.
No, it used to be that way. It used to be the conventions chose the nominees. So in 1880, for example, Rutherford B. Hayes was not seeking a second term. He was actually the last incumbent president, since Joe Biden was the first incumbent president since him, who did not seek a second term, who was a one-term president. Johnson and Truman both were part of the previous administrations as vice president. And in the 36th ballot, he was there to nominate John Sherman, his buddy from Ohio, as the president. Someone says, why don't you nominate this guy? And then people start yelling, Garfield, Garfield, Garfield. Eventually, James Garfield becomes the Republican nominee. That's how it used to be. The last time we really had it like that was 1968. Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic presidential nominee. He didn't participate in any primaries. Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war senator from Minnesota, participated in primaries, won primaries. And he came to the convention, and all of a sudden the convention gave it all to Humphrey. There were riots in the streets in Grant Park in Chicago. Consequently, there was a movement called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. George McGovern, senator from South Dakota, Darren Fraser, congressman from California, wrote up a plan which would give more power to the caucuses and the primaries. George McGovern used that himself when he ran for president in 1972. And since 1972, primaries have really been king of how to choose a presidential nominee. And Republicans just kind of followed suit, and all of a sudden Iowa becomes important as well, because they started the caucuses, in part because they started the caucuses in 1972. McGovern spent a lot of time there, did well there, and then in 1976, Carter spent a lot of time there and came in second to uncommitted in the state of Iowa, and landed up eventually winning the nomination. But Humphrey was the last person that did not participate in a primary. Basically, political parties are kind of like private clubs. They can really, if they wanted to, if the delegates at the convention said, we want some, let's say they said, we want Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina. They could have done that. It was just that Vice President Harris was kind of the heir apparent. So they said, we can support that person. But the delegates to the convention are, in some respects, can be, don't have to be, they can be recreated to what they're supposed to be.
Cool. Thanks for the civics lesson. We can go back to history now, Brian. Thank you.
Back to your
I mean, I think we've kind of got. I'm trying to think if there were other things. The other things, I don't know if we're ready to move into. Well, let's see. What was the next part? Well, I think the thing that I've really been thinking lately, and I said this in one of our podcasts, and thought it might be safe for me to climb under the table when I said it. And that is the question: does it really matter who wins this election?
Yes.
Now let me explain. I asked this question from the viewpoint of, there's a number of theorists, and it started, I think, I don't know when it started, but I know that Nietzsche,
Mhm.
he talked about the eternal recurrence. And then we had a historian that was a Russian American historian named Pitirim Sorokin. And he came up with, I think, what they call the social cycle theory. Now we have since then a professor named Turchin, and there's another. Let's see, I have it somewhere. Neil Howe and the fourth turning idea. And basically, these theories, one way or the other, they say, well, there's this big cycle. I think in the fourth turning, they're talking about 80 to 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in there, and that there's 4 chapters. And that, like in the fourth turning, I think the idea is that you have a crisis chapter, then you have the post crisis chapter, then you have an awakening chapter, and then you have an unraveling chapter, and then you're back again. So, so my thought is there something like a life cycle to an empire, a large institutional organization that's like an organism, and does it age? And can we vote our way out of aging?
That's a fascinating
Or is
question.
this something that is there something we just have to go through and sort of buckle down? And because this is connected to my thought of what are the real. So the question, does it matter who wins, is maybe more nuanced to say, in what ways does it matter? In what ways does it not matter? And, like if Congress is not devoted to solving problems, it doesn't really matter who's president, maybe. Or if the car has no brakes, it doesn't matter who's steering. So I'm wondering about those kinds of issues, and to put into perspective, what are realistic expectations for voters to have to come out of an election?
I think the one
Uh,
that reminds me of 2000 when Al Gore was running. And a lot of people, George W. Bush and Al Gore, were both trying to run to the center. So a lot of people on the left were saying that it's a waste of that, saying, why should we vote for either candidate? So Ralph Nader ran that year as a Green Party nominee. And Al Gore's had bumper stickers and it said it's about the Supreme Court, meaning essentially that you may disagree. You may think that Al Gore is part of the corporate party system. You may disagree with his points of view. You may think the whole idea of New Democrat Clinton Gore, you may not like that idea. But when it comes down to it, the next president is going to nominate two or three Supreme Court justices, and whoever that person is likely to either be somebody who's a contextualist, or somebody who has a more restrainist view of what the Constitution can do, someone in the mold of a Rehnquist, for example, or what eventually became somebody like a Samuel Alito. So Al Gore lands up losing that election barely to George W. Bush, and George W. Bush lands up appointing 2 members of the United States Supreme Court. 2016, Donald Trump gets elected. He lands up appointing 3 members of the Supreme Court. And then you have decisions like the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and you had 3 people on that three justices were appointed by Republican presidents who all voted to overturn Roe v. Wade and overturn the Casey decision, and bringing abortion rights back down to the states, for example. So if you're a contextualist, if you believe in a more contextualist view, if you're more of a restrainist view of the Constitution, you would say we need to vote for that person because he's going to nominate people that are restrainist to the United States Supreme Court. Contrary-wise, if you're somebody who's more progressive, you may say we want someone who believes the Constitution is more of a living document, and therefore we should nominate someone who's more of a progressive. Because basically, imagine if Al Gore or Hillary Clinton had appointed those Supreme Court justices instead. If they had nominated them, we would be living in a lot different. We would be living in a not different world, whether that's good or bad. The fact of the matter is, I think that the biggest legacy a president probably leaves, the biggest legacy is obviously war and peace, and then part of it is what the economy is during their presidency. But long term, it's what they do for the judiciary, for the higher and the inferior courts, if you will.
so go ahead, Bill.
I was gonna move on slightly, Brian. So if you have something on
Oh,
that, go
okay.
for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it contextualized by where we've been so far, the idea around abortion
Yes.
of putting it back to the states is kind of a Whig idea, isn't it? As opposed to a
Yeah.
Federalist idea, which was kind of the Democrat side or the power to the people side, as opposed to the federal government having all that power. But now we've switched again. And so the Democrats are on the side of putting the power into the federal government rather than into the state governments. And when I hear the buzz about this, I hear often just that the Republicans want to take away all your rights when that Supreme Court decision happened. When in fact what's happened is it's kind of shifted to the states away from the federal government. Is that fair to say,
Yes,
Ted?
and currently many states have actually enshrined into their constitution the right to an abortion. Every New England state, except for New Hampshire, for example, have that currently enshrined in the constitution, in their state constitutions. I think what you have as a scenario, basically what we thought it was going to be, states that are red states are going, non-libertarian red states, states that are more socially conservative, specifically states in the South like Louisiana, are going to restrict abortion rights. States that are more liberal, states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, are going to do the exact opposite. So that's basically the system that we have. What the Roe decision did is it made a federal right to an abortion, at least in the first two trimesters. Eventually, there actually were some regulations in the third trimester.
Right.
There's another theory too. Those who are very much anti-abortion believe that it should actually the 14th Amendment protects personhood, and it's
Right.
actually in the Constitution. So there are people in the right who actually say that this decision bringing it to the states was actually the wrong decision, and that it should actually that the federal government has a responsibility to protect all persons. So that's kind of where
Right.
it is right now.
Although we also have the precedent that each state decides issues like the death penalty.
Which is true, although there is a federal death penalty as well for folks like Timothy McVeigh, for example. But
For
generally
federal
speaking,
But I mean,
crimes.
as far as restricting,
there is
we let the states decide
states
that.
do. There is a federal capital punishment as well, but obviously most people that are on death row are not federal prisoners. They're state prisoners.
Right. Right.
Where I was gonna go, Rich, is related, right? So I'm remembering you mentioned the Supreme Court, and it made me think about at the end of the Obama administration, he nominated Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, if I remember
He did.
correctly,
Yep.
and it was like 6 months before his term was over, maybe, and but Congress would not advance a vote even. They didn't reject him. They just wouldn't even vote on Garland becoming a Supreme Court justice, if I remember correctly. They
Yeah,
wouldn't
that was Mitch
confirm him.
McConnell.
And so one thing we hear about a lot now is gridlock. And we talked early in this show about kind of the level of contentiousness we're experiencing now. But it seems like if you don't if the executive branch doesn't also control the legislative branch, then can it get anything done anymore? And is there precedent for that? And what are the implications of that? Where are we headed?
That's an interesting question, and part of it's different when your party controls the House and the Senate. When your party controls the House and the Senate, it's very easy to get legislation through. Go back to, for example, Lyndon Johnson in 64 and 65. He had overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate. His problem was more with the Southern conservative Democrats, but he actually had a lot of liberal Republicans that voted with him. But in that time period, he got the Civil Rights Act passed, he got Medicare passed, he got Head Start passed, the Rat Extermination Act, parts of the War on Poverty were passed. He got a lot of legislation passed in that short period of time. Somebody like, for example, on the other side of that, if you are working with a Congress from your other party, like Bill Clinton did basically his last 6 of his 8 years in office, in order for him to get legislation passed, he had to work across the aisle, which often was to the chagrin of the left wing of the Democratic Party. He worked with Republicans, for example, to get welfare reform, and he signed welfare reform in 1996. His opposition was in the left wing of the Democratic Party. In 1997, he passed the Balanced Budget Act, which he worked with Trent Lott, the majority leader, and Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House. They were all there at the White House in the Rose Gardens with the signing ceremony. On the other side of that, you had folks like Dick Gephardt, the House Minority Leader from Missouri, who were opposing. But in order for Bill Clinton to be successful those 6 years legislatively, he knew he had to. It's just a numerical. It's a mathematical thing. You need to work with people on the other side. his first 2 years in office, when he got the Budget Reconciliation Pact, he got it passed by one vote in the House, one vote in the Senate, with no Republicans voting for it whatsoever. He couldn't do that his second 2 years in office. So you have to kind of work with who's there. Theoretically, I think that if you have a president, say, who's a Democrat, and you have an overwhelming majority in the House and the Senate that are Republicans, and the president does not want to side with the Senate, the House are giving them, and keeps vetoing it, then you do have a situation of gridlock. But if you look in history, you do have a lot of scenarios where there's a lot of legislation that you don't really, that's not sexy, that aren't hot button issues, that actually do pass almost overwhelmingly, like getting, for example, the suicide hotline, that type of thing. And the presidents do tend to sometimes sign things unanimously. Oftentimes, when you turn on C-SPAN and you see that they're doing a vote, and you can hear, Beethoven in the background, sometimes you'll look at this legislation and it's something about, say, the entertainment industry, or something you never heard of, and you look at the votes and it's like 434 to 1 or something like that. There is that type of legislation that does pass bipartisan. It's just that there's no reason for the press to cover it because it's very technical to explain, and I don't think that it's necessarily something that people see as really having an effect. And whereas if it's something like a hot button issue, it's going to take up a lot of time, and the members of the House and the Senate, thinking about their potential re-elections, moving up, or running for president, want to get as much airtime as possible to spout and talk about it.
So it's fair to say there's there it's not all contentious,
No,
and there's precedent for the amount of gridlock we have today. This is not an unusual situation.
yeah,
What we're calling political gridlock.
yes, and you do. By the way, you also have it sometimes in states too. It's states, and it's layer cake federalism, the same thing. Oftentimes, you have situations where a legislature keeps trying to pass legislation and the governor keeps vetoing it. Some cases, like in Vermont, where you have an overwhelmingly Democratic state legislature and a Republican governor, Phil Scott, the Democrats will pass legislation, Governor Spot will veto it, then it will go back, and the Senate can sometimes override them. Interesting strategy. In Massachusetts, interestingly, from 1991 to 2007, had all Republican governors. And this is fascinating because it was such a Democratic state. And part of the reason they won is they would say, I'm going to be a check on the other party, and I'm going to be a social moderate. And people realized that they had no real power. So when Mitt Romney ran for governor in 2002, he had a big sign up, and it showed a picture of what he called the Gang of Three, which would be his opponent, Shannon O'Brien, the treasurer who would become governor, then Speaker Tom Finneran, and then the Senate president to be Robert Travellini, and it called the Gang of Three. And he would constantly run against them in that race. In that race, it was very interesting. It was very hard for Shannon O'Brien to make the case why one party should be hegemonic over all three branches of government. So sometimes it can actually work to your favor. But as I say, he never had much power actually as governor, except if he wanted to work with Democrats and sign legislation. Obviously, there would be some pat to go with that.
And he called them the Gang of Three, of course, because he was making a reference to the Gang of Four, which was a group that took control of the Chinese Communist
Oh,
Party
really?
through a particular.
Interesting. Interesting. That's really interesting.
Uh, but, but I
I did
digress.
not know that. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Um, uh, Bo, do you have a next direction? I have just a couple catch ups.
I was wondering um, whether Trump wins or loses. We hear that the Republican Party is forever changed, and maybe the country is forever changed. Where do you think the Republican Party is headed? Is MAGA the new Republican Party, or do you see it kind of moving back towards the Bush and Cheney, you know, ideology that we were talking about earlier? Is there momentum in a particular direction regardless of Trump, or is it really just about him?
It's a great question. I think most Republican politicians wanted to go back to the status quo ante, the status quo before the status quo. But they know that their voters, someone like that's established, and someone like Marco Rubio from Florida, I'm sure, for example, does not like Donald Trump's views on foreign intervention, probably does not like his views on trade, but he's willing to go with it in order to get reelected himself and potentially look as a presidential candidate in 2028. I think Donald Trump's brand in the Republican Party is taken over at least for the next election. If Donald Trump loses miserably, and I don't think he will, I think if he loses, it'll be a close race. There'll be a lot of more establishment Republicans who will come and say we need somebody from another wing of the Republican Party. If he loses or wins a close election by 2028, I think every candidate is going to try to co-opt Trump's message. There'll be some candidate, there'll be somebody that'll want to go back to the status quo ante, maybe somebody in the Lynn Cheney mold. But I think that generally speaking, I think even the rank and file Republican voters, if you ask them, for example, today about the Iraq War, which was almost ecumenically favorable when George W. Bush was president, a lot of them would say today that they're against the idea of foreign intervention. So the Republican Party has kind of become the Democratic Party, if you will, on that issue. And I just try to, as I say, I was imagining at the convention, if somebody like George W. Bush were to give a speech at the Republican convention, or Dick Cheney were to come up and give a speech, I bet they neither of them even showed up, by the way. I bet they would both be roundly booed by the convention because they are so out of step. Now, you go back to 2004, imagine somebody at the convention booing George W. Bush or Dick Cheney. I mean, they would be thrown out of the convention because that was the ideology of the Republican Party. And George W. Bush had, 98%, had about 90% approval in the Republican Party. Now they're really kind of on the outs, and I think that that's why you have a scenario where Dick Cheney has endorsed Vice President Harris and George W. Bush has yet to make an endorsement.
Is another way to think about that, Rich, that Trump, was kind of like a virus within the Republican Party, but he really represents something different altogether. And so without
Yeah,
him, the Republican Party might try to go back to what it is, but what is the something else that Trump represents? Like when you say Bush and Cheney are so out of step with the current party, what do you see as like the core things that Trump is about? Because he talks about a lot of different things, um, and different people kind of resonate with different aspects of that. What do you think is central there?
I think a couple things. One of them is foreign policy, the idea that the United States should not be involved in foreign wars, the idea that the United States should kind of retrench from foreign conflicts, that they should not be sending their young men and women off to foreign conflicts. Donald Trump tends to star the fact that he says he was the first president since the 30s that did not did not start any sort of wars when he was president. Actually, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter didn't either. But at any rate, in other words, you had, for example, some of the smaller wars like Bill Clinton in Kosovo, Ronald Reagan in Grenada. So, and certainly other presidents that had or inherited wars, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, and for that matter, the first few years of Gerald Ford, for example, in Vietnam. I think Ford actually did the final pull in '75, but Nixon, obviously, Henry Kissinger made the final agreement. But I think that's part of it, is the idea that the United States should not be involved in foreign wars. The other part is that there should be restrictions on trade. Donald Trump keeps saying the best word in the dictionary is tariff. That's something, by the way, for all of his machinations, for all of his transmogrifications ideologically. You go back to interviews with him with Oprah Winfrey back in 1989. He's talking about, let's put tariffs on China. Let's put tariffs. He loves the idea of tariffs. There's one thing, if you think Donald Trump doesn't believe in anything, there's one thing he believes in, that's protective tariffs. That's going to be on his tombstone. I support protective tariffs, and that's the best word in the dictionary. So he basically wants economic nationalism. And the other thing is immigration. He wants there to be restrictions on immigration. It was his view. I remember back in 1994 when Pete Wilson was running for re-election as governor of California, and they had Proposition 187, which would greatly restrict the rights of undocumented migrants or illegal immigrants, depending on what your perspective is. Pete Wilson was an advocate for it. A lot of Republicans, George W. Bush among them, Jack Kemp, another one, landed up condemning Pete Wilson for his support of the measure. But the measure landed up passing nonetheless. But it's just a very interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon, and I think that if you ask most rank and file Republicans about trade, about foreign wars, and about immigration, they would be more in line with Donald Trump than they would be in line with George W. Bush or Dick Cheney.
What about to what extent is this election between Trump and Harris a kind of moratorium or a decision point on where this country is relative to critical theory and wokeism and Black Lives Matter on one hand, versus let's say, liberal values or traditional liberal values.
Yeah.
It seems like some of the folks, including Elon Musk, that are supporting Trump and were Democrats not long ago, have made that their main reason for it. I just saw an interview with Bill Ackman talking about, and he's been a lifelong Democrat and big time donor, and he's saying that the rise in anti-Semitism that came out of kind of DEI and critical race theory and things like that in schools was it was oh, was not going to be uh, how do I say it? Where like under a Harris administration that was going to continue, and under a Trump administration it might not. So, how much is that on your radar, and how important do you think that is?
I don't think there's going to be any difference between who the president of the United States is. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about anti-Semitism because, first of all, anti-Semitism is real and it's on the right and it's on the left. But that being said, there are also those, and you have to bifurcate them, that question the policy of Israel in Gaza, that question Israel's foreign policy. And there's a difference between questioning Israel's foreign policy and saying directly that you believe that the Jews, for example, have power in Hollywood, or you believe that, or saying that you believe that the state of Israel should be blown to smithereens, that type of thing. That's anti-Semitism. Saying that you believe that, saying that you are against the embargo on Gaza, saying that saying, for example, that you think that there should not be that there should be an arms embargo, that you want to end the war in Gaza, something to that effect. I think that's not anti-Semitism. That's part of a healthy part of the debate, if you will. But I think whoever the president of the United States is, I think that there's still going to be, and anti-Semitism isn't just on college campuses; it's around the country, and it's in all different sorts of factions, and it's on both the right, and it's certainly on the left, as is all forms of prejudice, including racism and homophobia and everything else.
So that brings me up the question to me, like Bo asked about the Republican Party. After this all, and the smoke clears, should it clear, where does the Democratic Party go after this?
That's a great question. I think the Democratic Party pretty much has their ideology. And I think that the one issue where they're different, where there's a difference in the party between the progressives and the center left moderates, and a lot of the liberals as well, at least the liberals that have large, at least some of the liberals in the Democratic Party, is certainly over the issue of Israel and Gaza and foreign policy in general. And Israel and Gaza, there are those that believe that the United States should have almost unfettered support for Israel, although many of them question. I'm thinking of someone like Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, although many of them, I think this is almost ecumenical in the Democratic Party, they do question Bibi Netanyahu. Very few Democrats are, I think, sympathetic to the Likud party, the conservative party in Israel. They are, however, sympathetic to the state of Israel, and they believe that the United States is on the side of good in terms of funding Israel, and in terms of they believe that Israel is certainly on the side. They would, most of them, I think, if you really come down to it, would favor some sort of binational state where there is Palestinians and Israelis living side by side. But generally speaking, they want to fund Israel, and they believe Israel is on the right side. Then there are those on the left wing of the Democratic Party, and the Green Party, for that matter, who believe that the United States is responsible for the civilian suffering in Gaza, and they believe that if there was an arms embargo, if the United States stopped shipping arms to Israel, that Israel would have a ceasefire and they would make peace, to something to that effect. But the one argument I don't hear from anyone really in the United States that's in any sort of, from the left to the right, is the idea that Israel should not, at least in its current form, that the United States should not, that there should not be an Israel. That's a theory I don't hear that from anybody, at least from the left or the right. It's a matter of Israel's foreign policy, where Israel should be. And I think the center left and the center right probably both agree that there should be some sort of a binational state in the fait accompli.
Now, in both parties, do you think that there is a certain faction of leadership that's kind of aging out of the game and being replaced by the next wave? And do
Yeah.
you see that affecting this conversation?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Nancy Pelosi, she's still in the House of Representatives, but she's basically a rank and file member now from San Francisco, so she can focus more on local issues. She's actually the Speaker Emeritus, I think the person who could become speaker in coming Tuesday is Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from New York, who's somebody who has very little name recognition, which is great for Democrats because Nancy Pelosi was the boogie person for every Republican running from Mississippi to Maine to everywhere else. They tried to put their Democrat, they tried to tether that Democrat to Nancy Pelosi. And the fact that Nancy Pelosi represents San Francisco is a godsend to Republicans because they can try to say that if you're running in northern Maine, that means that you want to turn northern Maine into San Francisco because you support Nancy Pelosi. Something to that effect. That's why Jared Golden, the one who represented northern Maine, would not vote for Nancy Pelosi. That's why Gene Taylor from Mississippi, at least one time, did not vote for Nancy Pelosi. Last time he did, and it landed up hurting him. That's part of the reason he lost re-election. Right now, because Congressman Jeffries has such little name recognition, he's really not being used in any political advertisements around the country against incumbent Democrats. Someone like Chuck Schumer, I think my guess is he's probably in his last term. I think the Democratic High Command will probably turn to somebody else, maybe Cory Booker, somebody who's very charismatic and likable that would potentially become the Senate Minority Leader or Senate Majority Leader after him if he's still in the United States Senate. Then, so I can see that. I can see definitely I can see the Democrats kind of turning over to a new brand of Democrat. And my guess is that if Hakeem Jeffries does become Speaker of the House, and it's very possible in a couple of days, in about a month, he will be a household word.
Right.
And with the sort of, little bit of success of RFK Jr., and Vivek Ramaswamy and folks like that, do you see the potential of? I know Vivek ran as a Republican in the primaries, but just in terms of like kind of outsiders getting some traction, do you see third parties or fourth parties even gaining any traction in on the national scene?
I don't.
Great question.
One thing about America, unlike a place like Israel where there are 39 parties in the Knesset, it's extremely hard for a third party to win, in part because the argument is the wasted vote syndrome. Usually, if there's a third party or an independent candidate that's very formidable, first of all, it has to come from the center. Once it comes from the left or the right, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party appeal to a very narrow cross section of constituencies. Consequently, they usually land up garnering about 1 or 2% of the vote. They have to appeal to a more centrist faction, and that's happened a couple times, and it usually has to be a unity party. John Anderson in 1980, he was a Republican who ran in the Republican primaries, congressman from Illinois. He landed up losing the primaries, continued running, and ran as an independent, and picked Governor Pat Lucey, the Democratic governor of Wisconsin. At one point during the summer of 1980, they were actually in second place, and he was at 25% of the vote. Gradually, the Carter campaign, because he was taking progressive voters who voted for Jerry Brown or Ted Kennedy in the primary against Kennedy, gradually they started to dissipate. And by the day of the election, John Anderson only won 6.6% of the vote. Same with Ross Perot. At one point, Perot was actually ahead of Clinton and Bush. Gradually, they started to make the wasted vote syndrome argument, and he goes down to 18.9%. Christy Miles, running for governor of Massachusetts, at one point was in second place. He ended up winning about 6%. That's usually what happens. Whoever is going to lose from the third party and believes that they're going to hurt them more automatically says a vote for this person is really a vote for somebody else. In other words, you vote for candidate A, you're really voting for candidate C because you're not voting for me, candidate B. Now, there have been exceptions to this at the gubernatorial level. Walter Hinkle, for example, the governor of Alaska. Angus King got elected governor of Maine in 1994 and then was reelected in 1998 as an independent. Jesse Ventura in 1998, and that year, Norm Coleman, the mayor of St. Paul, he was the Republican nominee. Skip Humphrey was the Democratic nominee, the attorney general. And Norm Coleman said a vote for Jesse Ventura is a vote for Skip Humphrey. What happened in the final analysis? Jesse Ventura landed up winning that election, shocking the world, as he said. He body slammed the establishment, I guess.
Bodies.
He body slammed the establishment. He became Minnesota governor. But all three of those candidates had one thing in common. Another one would be Lowell Weicker. Lowell Weicker became governor of Connecticut in 1990. They all did it from the center. And they were all out, and they also had name recognition. Hinkle was a former governor. Angus King used to be on public television in Maine, so they had universal name recognition. Jesse Ventura was actually the former mayor of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, which was the sixth biggest city in Minnesota at the time. So they can't come from nowhere. They have to run from the center. Now, in the presidential race level, there's one thing that will make it so that the wasted syndrome vanishes from the page of time, and that would be instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting. So in 2000, for example, when Ralph Nader was running, if you were to vote for Ralph Nader as your first choice, and then Al Gore is your second choice, the Ralph Nader does not garner 15% of the vote. Your second choice becomes Al Gore. So you can vote for both candidates, and you can do it with a clean conscience. On the right-hand side, if you would vote for Pat Buchanan's your first choice. Buchanan loses because he doesn't get 15%. George W. Bush is your second choice. George W. Bush becomes president. So there certainly is some precedent for it. That's certainly rather a way to kind of handle it, to make it so that people can vote their consciences without worrying about having the candidate they least want to win winning the presidential election.
And maybe one of the biggest questions in this election, whether it's real or not, is election integrity, right? We already know about arsonists destroying some ballots that had been delivered up in I think in the Pacific Northwest, in
Washington, yeah.
Oregon and Washington. I'm seeing all kinds of stuff on Twitter about uh, voter files being purged within 90 days of the election and that being illegal. And one screenshot I saw of the same person with the same voter ID voting 29 times already in Virginia. And I don't know what's true and what's not, but what can you tell us about the integrity of American elections?
Not very much, because we really don't know. We don't know. I mean, from what everybody that works, I will say that the best way to try to figure out if an election is on the level is to be a poll worker, to volunteer, and to be somebody that actually watches the elections, to stand there, and when people come and you say, what's your name, sir? What street do you live on? And then you can actually watch the actual process. I think most people that do that and watch the process, no matter where they are in the ideological spectrum, tend to say that there's really very little actual voter fraud. There's always going to be isolated cases of it in every election. It's always. I think they found about 20. There's probably going to be a certain amount of it, but I mean, how demonstrable it is, how big it is, I don't know. But it's certainly always going to be an issue. I will say though, the ID, because you hear this a lot, that they should have a law that people should bring an ID. Maybe the best way to solve that would be that when you go there, there'd be people there because if you don't have an ID, if you really live someplace in a rural part of the country where you don't drive and you don't have an ID, you go there, and then when you go there, somebody makes you an ID and then says for future elections you can use this ID, and then that way you guarantee that or they have to send the ID somehow to every single person, because I'm sure there are people in rural parts of the country that do not have IDs.
Now, and I have a related question to this. People seem to be in question or suspicious about the elections.
Yeah.
And do you think that this might be connected to, Plato said that one of the big problems with democracy is that eventually some people learn how to rob the treasury.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that populism is kind of one of the things that's been shifting back and forth from party to party. And, you brought up Nancy Pelosi. And so naturally, I think of insider trading.
Yep.
And do you think that there's a solution to that? I heard an argument. There's a guy now who's making an argument for monarchy. And he says the good thing about monarchy is that then the person in control has no interest in robbing the treasury because he already owns it all.
Yeah.
But when you have an elected official, they're there and they know that someday the sun don't shine on the same dog's ass forever. So they've got to get as rich as they can while they have access to the influence and the power that they have. And so that's the argument that says that, if things get too loosey goosey, we end up sliding into oligarchy because some people have astronomical wealth that they've managed to get out of their position. Do you think that there's a dawning in this evolution of the parties?
Yep.
And with the elevation of the expression of the individual, which is, I would argue, started with the Christian movement, and then through the French Revolution and then through the Reformation, and that all of these is about an increasing level of the individual's expression. And so my question is, do you think with the information revolution and the individual being more empowered with information, how long are we going to settle for people coming out of political office being worth hundreds of millions of dollars because of the connections they got kind of by working for
I
us?
guess that would be the case for electing people that already have money. Somebody like a Steve Forbes, or somebody that comes with money. If you come with that much money, you're probably not going to be involved in the graft and that type of a thing. I guess.
Or Donald
Or
Trump?
Donald Trump. Yeah, that is the case for making. That is the case. I guess theoretically, somebody that's wealthy is just going to want more money, so they could come there and say, "All right, I'm elected now. I'm just going to make more money." But is that their actual interest? Some of them, first of all, a lot of them come to office with the intent of moving up. If you run a seat in the House of Representatives, you may not want to necessarily stay there. You may think it's all going to be. You may think it's all just you're just there to kind of get your card punched. Then you can run for governor. Then you can run for Senate. There is an argument for that. One thing that would solve this all is term limits. The problem with term limits is that as soon as you get into office, there will be lobbyists that will come to you and say, and it would probably intimate to you, not to say directly, but you're going to be out of here in a couple of years. So they might say, you do you do what you want. You try to get it, help us on the committee, and then we're going to get you a job in 12 years because we know you're going to be out of there, which I guess is kind of perversely an argument for career politicians, because if someone's going to stay there, if it's someone like a Bob Byrd or a Carl Hayden from Arizona or Strom Thurmond is going to stay there forever, Pete Domenici, 36 years from New Mexico, I guess that they're probably less likely to become a lobbyist afterward, just because they're going to be in there so long, and that's not going to be their ambition. In terms of how people make money when they're in there, I guess let's be altruistic here and say that most people come to office with the intent of doing good things and helping their constituents. Then all of a sudden there's some sort of an urge, and you say, wow, I can really make this type of money, and I can really, I can do this, and didn't necessarily come from money. I think a lot of people would take that urge. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm taking most of the people that criticize those politicians. If they actually
Absolutely.
got into office and saw that temptation, they'd be looking at it and they'd be saying, oh my gosh, I could be set for life. I don't know how you necessarily get rid of that, other than just simply, having only people that are already wealthy in office. I guess Ross Perot kind of tried to, I guess you could make that case. I already kind of have that money, so why would I be in it? But I don't think it's the number one issue. I think people that are as intelligent as politicians are, and I think most of them are pretty intelligent, I think they would probably be better off, even with the corruption, making more money in the financial sector than they would in politics. But that being said, I think a lot of them probably start in politics, and then someone like Eric Cantor, for example, if you remember, he was the Senate Majority Leader from Virginia, and he ended up losing his own seat to David Bratton in the 2014 primaries. And he, of course, went on to Wall Street and got paid $3 million. So you probably think if he probably, I'm sure, is a lot happier that he's actually lost that seat than he is now. One other thing that's really interesting: think of how many members of the House and Senate, after they leave office, go back to their districts to live. Very few, actually,
Oh,
and a lot of
yeah,
them actually land up being buried in the suburban Washington area. You go in there, you represent your constituents, and then once you get there, you become part of the Washington culture, and all of a sudden you lose re-election, or you run for an office, don't win it, or you retire. Very few people are going to say, okay, I'm going to go back to my home state and live a quiet life. They've kind of become part of that Washington culture. That's where their friends are, and that's where associations are. So consequently, they're going to spend time there rather than going back
right.
to their home states.
Like George Washington did.
Yeah, he went back. Right, he went 1797. He went back to his home in Virginia. A lot of politicians today will, whether it's taking a lobbying position or whatever it is, they become more or less part of the Washington culture. And when they leave, they see themselves more as a Washingtonian than they do an Iowan or an Arkansan or or somebody from Connecticut, where their constituents are. They might think that's kind of a boring life. They've really kind of seen what the life is like in Washington versus a suburban life, and I think they like the Washington life a lot better. And obviously their friends become more the lobbyists than they do the person that the coach in the little league game.
Right. So there are friends in Washington. That thing about getting a
Oh
dog
gosh,
is
no,
just
they're all over the place in Washington, and they stay in Washington too. That was that was a misnomer by Harry Truman that the only friend you have in Washington is the job. I do remember Thomas Foley. If you remember, he was Speaker of the House, and when he ran for re-election in 1994, he represented the Spokane, Washington area. His slogan was "Fighting for Our Washington."
interesting.
Uh, I just saw a headline. I'm going to read the article this afternoon if I have time. Coleman Hughes just wrote about Puerto Rico's statehood referendum being on the ballot this year and being positioned differently, where apparently Puerto Ricans can vote for um, they can't vote for the status quo. They can I forget what the options were. One was becoming a state, and I forget what the other options were. But staying as is was not an option, even though something like 86% of Puerto Ricans last time this was a ballot issue voted to keep things as is. Are you following that at all, Rich?
Yeah, I know that there's a gubernatorial race there, and that one of the candidates is for essentially separation. And
Oh, that's
within
right. That was the other option. Yeah,
and
sovereignty.
in Puerto Rico,
Always an
Oh
obvious
yeah.
option.
in Puerto Rico, there are really that's really the flagship issue in terms of they don't real they're in terms of left and right. There are those who want to remain is a territorial status, those who want statehood, and then those who want separation. And this time around, one of the candidates that's running that's actually a third party candidate and has actually become almost on the pedestal of the other two candidates wants to a complete separation. I think that from a political standpoint, obviously, Democrats believe that Puerto Rico are forced Puerto Rico statehood. They believe that if Puerto Rico becomes a state, that they would then theoretically get about 4 congressmen, and they think that those congressmen would vote Democrat. Again, many of them they also might be socially conservative, so there could be a Republican aspect of that as well. The territories are in an interesting perspective. You have Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Guam, and the Northern Mariana
Oh,
Islands. And they all send a non-voting representative to the United States House of Representatives, no one to the Senate. The non-voting representative to the United and District of Columbia. They're not voting for the United States House of Representatives. They are allowed to vote in committee, and they can propose pieces of legislation. The only thing they can't do is, in the end of the day, is vote on the legislation. That's always been some thought process that there should be something that they should get actual voting representation. And currently, Puerto Rico does not have that.
So, so I have to ask because you've done a great job, Rich, being nonpartisan and non-ideological. Is there any issue that gets up under your saddle where you do have an opinion and like and it's important to you and is going to be a significant factor in how you vote? What's your hot issue?
I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Okay, so intelligence, got it.
well, I can tell you, even though that and maybe are we ready to go here? I said I'm nonpartisan, but honestly, I'm totally in the bag for the pony-based economy of Vermin Supreme.
Vermin Supreme, and I met
And
him in New Hampshire. Very
I know
interesting
you
guy.
met
He
him.
was he was what he does in New Hampshire on the day of the primary. All the candidates go into this one hotel, the Marriott Hotel, and they're all going around from the radio station to radio station, TV station, being interviewed, and he follows them around and starts trying to ask them annoying questions. And he started doing this to Marjorie Taylor Greene, to Vivek Ramaswamy. And I saw, for example, that some of the candidates, as soon as they look out and they see him, they try to just walk from one as fast as they possibly can, so that they don't get the video footage of them with Vermin Supreme standing in the back with his big boot on his head.
I would love to do an interview with Vermin.
I don't think that would actually be that hard, and you actually look a little bit like
If
him
you could
too.
hook us up, I would be eternally indebted. And another question I had, moving past the pony-based economy, and in New Mexico, we have had a pony-based economy, so that's why I'm so partial to it. Um, but I notice he wears the boot of democracy, right?
That's correct.
So now is it a right foot boot or a left foot boot, or does he switch back and forth? Or is this a question I need to save for him?
That's a question you need to save for him. The thing is, all I know is when I see him in New Hampshire, and I've seen him the last 2 elections now, he just kind of stands out in front and he just kind of waits and he just kind of hazes people. the candidates. He's got two or three advisors that go around with him, and they try to ask questions. Like they'd ask all the candidates. They say, "What's your favorite Led Zeppelin song? What's your favorite Led Zeppelin song?" And and everyone just completely ignores him. I remember one of the guys for Trump, because one of the guys with Donald Trump Jr. was just saying, "Go away, vermin," but they all kind of know that he's there, and they know that he's there for humor. And it's really fascinating. At one point, Marjorie Taylor Greene was being interviewed, and you could see him in the background going like this, making all sorts of faces and everything else. So he's fascinating, and he runs just about every time as a this time around he ran as a Democrat, but he's run as a Libertarian before as well.
Oh, okay. Now, see, now the serious question that I have about Vermin is, he's not necessarily a one-off, right? And I'm thinking of back when another New Mexican, Wavy Gravy,
I thought you were going to say
had
Pat
the
Carlson.
nobody. Oh no, well, the nobody for president campaign, and I guess Pat Paulson would be in there, and also in Mexico we have a luchador, and his name was Super Barrio. And the luchadors are the wrestlers, and he ran for president of Mexico on 2 occasions.
That is fast. That
And so I'm interested in, is there an implication to satire candidates? Is there a time when they seem to show up? Does it mean something about the relationship between the people at large and their government?
that's a great,
What do you have
that's a
on that? What do you
great
think?
question. I think that most of them are perennial candidates. And actually, there are a lot of people that run as perennial candidates that you don't know about. For example, if you want to get on the New Hampshire ballot to run for president, and you're a U.S. citizen, you're 35 years of age, all you have to do is give $1,000 to the state of New Hampshire, and you're basically going to be on that ballot. You're going to be on the Republican ballot, or the Democratic ballot. People will go to the polls and they're going to see your name. It's all in alphabetical order. It's very easy to run. People have no idea how easy it
Wow.
actually is to run. So when you go up to New Hampshire on that day, there are a lot of minor presidential candidates that will walk around, all greeting you, and they walk around to all the radio stations and say, "Would you like to interview me?" And usually the radio hosts kind of brush them off, but they walk around and they are actual candidates for president, and sometimes they actually have platforms that they carry around, or they have sheets with what they stand for, and they carry them around and they start handing them to people. This is actually happens in New
Fascinating.
Hampshire. It's a lot easier. Some of them, maybe they're joke candidates, but I think a lot of them, it's just basically in New Hampshire, they say that, the old slogan is anybody can run for president. In New Hampshire, it's actually true. If you just have $1,000, you can basically be a presidential candidate.
Well, maybe in the future when we're a powerful and influential podcast, we could run a contest where we could actually sponsor somebody to be a presidential candidate in New
That's a
Hampshire.
great
I kind of
idea.
like that idea. The Fools and Sages
The
candidate.
Fool.
And have a GoFundMe page. Yes, that's a great idea.
There we go. Yeah. Um,
Good. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to ask you, Bo, if there was anything else, if we've left any stones
Well,
unturned.
I think this might be a good stopping point. And what I'd love to do, Rich, is after the dust settles a little bit on the election, if the dust settles, to bring you back and
Sure.
talk about how that went and what impressions you have. And I don't know if that's another long form or a shorter follow up, but depending on kind of how meaty that seems, come next Tuesday or Wednesday.
Sounds
So
great.
I think
And before we leave, I want to get your prediction.
Oh gosh. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to have to make a prediction. So here's what my prediction is going to be. Jill Stein will not win.
Okay, I'm going to hold you to that, man. And you know how us OG gangsters are about this kind of shite,
I
man.
hear that, yo.
um,
Great.
Rich, do you have any appearances or lectures coming up that you want to plug?
No,
New books.
well, I'll be. I'm just doing. Just that I'm going to do. I'm doing a lot of appearances on Fox News Live right now, and I'm certainly doing some speaking at. Usually, I spoke yesterday at a senior center in Framingham, Massachusetts, but I'll doing a station in Orlando Monday and Tuesday, so hopefully I'll do a lot more. And if anybody if you're looking for a political speaker for your convention or anything else, I'd be more than happy to do that.
And where do they find you, Rich?
You can go, a couple of things. You can go to richrubino.com, RICHRUBINO.com, or just go on Facebook and type in Rich and then RUBINO, and I'm on there as well.
Perfect.
And we will have all that stuff on our show notes also if people forget that or they want to
Sounds great.
have a written address. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Rich. It's such an honor to have you as our first guest. I learned a ton today,
I learned so
and
much.
I really look forward to catching up with you again.
Thank you so much.
Again,
Greatly enjoyed it. We'll do it again. We'll do it again sometime.
absolutely. You made my day. You made my week. You made my month, actually. I just wanted to say thanks, everybody who has made it this far. We really appreciate your support. And come and check out some of the other things that we have. All of our stuff, you can get information and links at foolsandsagespodcast.com.